A trauma patient grabbed the gurney rail and vomited black fluid across the emergency room floor. His eyes rolled white. His chest stopped moving. And while 3 physicians stood frozen, staring at monitors that made no sense, a supply nurse in the corner of the room quietly set down her inventory clipboard, looked at the patient's fingernails, looked at the color of his lips, and said, in a voice so calm it cut through every alarm in the building, "That's not internal bleeding. Clear the room, now. Bita siki." Nobody moved. She said it again. "I said clear the room. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who stays until the very last second of a story, this one is for you. Follow this channel so you do not miss what happens next. Like this video. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, Mus. I want to see exactly how far this story travels." Now let's go back to the beginning. Harlow County General Hospital sat at the edge of Delwood City like something the rest of the medical district had quietly agreed to stop thinking about. It was not the worst hospital in the state. That distinction went to a facility 3 counties over that had been cited 11 times in 4 years. But Harlow County General was the kind of place where ambition went to wear down, where the good nurses burned out in 18 months and the mediocre ones stayed forever, where the emergency department ran at 112% capacity on a Tuesday afternoon and nobody in administration seemed to find that particularly alarming. The ER charge physician was a man named Dr. Preston Vale. He was 47, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional so many times and for so long that he had stopped questioning whether it was true. He had trained at a respected program. He had published 2 papers that were cited in other papers. He drove a car that cost more than most of his nursing staff made in a year, and he parked it in the spot closest to the entrance because he had simply decided one morning that it was his spot, and nobody had ever said otherwise. Preston Vale was not a bad physician in the technical sense. He knew pharmacology. He could read a CT scan. In controlled conditions, with good support staff and adequate time, he performed competently. But emergency medicine is almost never controlled conditions, and Preston Vale's greatest skill, the one he had refined over 2 decades, was the ability to project certainty he did not always feel, loudly enough that people stopped asking follow-up questions. He ran his department with that certainty. He directed his staff with it, and when something did not fit his initial read, he did not revise his read. He increased his volume. The staff had learned to work around him, not against him. That was career-ending, but around him, the way water finds the edge of a stone. The experienced nurses knew which battles to pick. The newer ones were still figuring it out. And then there was Megan Solis. She had been at Harlow County General for 11 months. She had come with no particular fanfare, applied through the standard process, listed her prior experience on a form that nobody had looked at very carefully, and been assigned to the supply and logistics rotation, which meant she spent the majority of her shifts restocking crash carts, auditing medication inventory, moving equipment between floors, and handling the kind of invisible, essential work that kept an emergency department functional and that almost nobody with authority ever noticed. She was 34. She was quiet. She had brown eyes that moved around a room in a way that some people found unsettling. Not aggressive, just watchful, the kind of watchfulness that suggested she was cataloging things. She wore her dark hair back, kept her scrubs clean, and never appeared to be in a hurry even when she was moving fast. She did not talk much about herself. When colleagues asked about her background, she said she had worked in trauma settings before. She said it in a way that did not invite more questions. In 11 months, she had not made a single friend in the department. That was not entirely her fault. The department did not make friendship easy, but Megan Solis also did not try very hard, and people had noticed and people had drawn conclusions from it, the way people always do when someone will not perform the usual social rituals. She was called cold. She was called strange. One of the senior nurses, a woman named Darla Brentwood, who had been at Harlow County General for 16 years and ran the break room conversation like a small fiefdom, had decided early on that Megan was arrogant, that the quiet was actually condescension, and had made sure that opinion spread. It had spread. By month 4, most of the ER staff had absorbed the version of Megan Solis that Darla Brentwood had distributed, which was that she was standoffish, that she thought she was better than everyone, that she had probably washed out of something and landed here and was embarrassed about it. Nobody asked her directly. Nobody offered her the version of themselves that might have made her offer hers in return. They just let the gap sit there, and eventually the gap became the relationship. Dr. Vale had his own version. His version was simpler. She was supply staff. She had no clinical authority. She was there to make sure the shelves were stocked and to stay out of his way while he ran the department. He had made this clear 3 times in her first month. Once in a hallway, when she had mentioned, not to him, to another nurse, that a patient in Bay 6 had an unusual respiratory pattern. He had overheard it. He had come around the corner and said, without lowering his voice, "We don't need inventory staff forming clinical opinions. Stick to what you know." The other nurse had looked at the floor. Megan had looked at him with those flat, watchful eyes and said nothing. Once in a staff meeting, when she had raised a question about the decontamination protocol for chemical exposure cases, a question that was, objectively, a reasonable question about a gap in the protocol, and Dr. Vale had cut her off midway through and said, in front of 12 people, "Supply nurses don't set medical protocol. Is there a relevant equipment concern? If not, we can move on." Again, she said nothing. She wrote something in the small notebook she always carried. She did not look embarrassed. That had irritated him more than any argument would have. Once in the parking lot, when she was coming off a double shift and he was arriving, and he had said, with the particular casual cruelty of someone who does not think they are being cruel, "You look tired, Solis. Maybe this environment isn't the right fit." She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had walked inside. 11 months of this. 11 months of stocking shelves and watching and saying almost nothing, and the whole department had decided they knew who she was. They were wrong. Look, the morning it all broke open was a Thursday in March. The weather had been doing something complicated for 2 days. Cold rain that kept turning to sleet and back again. The kind of weather that coats road surfaces in invisible film and makes drivers overestimate their stopping distance. The overnight crew had already handled 4 motor vehicle accidents and 1 pedestrian trauma before Megan came in at 7. She checked in at the nursing station, signed her paperwork, pulled her assignment sheet, and started her inventory round on the west side of the department. She had a system. She moved from bay to bay with her clipboard, cross-referencing par levels, flagging discrepancies, checking expiration dates on medications in the crash cart drawers. She had found 3 expired epinephrine prefills in the past month that nobody else had caught. She had quietly replaced them and noted it and said nothing about it to anyone, which Darla Brentwood had interpreted as more evidence of arrogance. She doesn't even tell anyone, just does it like the rest of us aren't capable, rather than as what it actually was, which was efficiency. She was on her 3rd bay when the call came over the radio. Multiple casualties inbound. Highway 9 interchange. Commercial tanker involved. At least 24 patients projected, arriving in waves over the next 45 minutes. Status on the lead patient, critical, mechanism unknown, driver of the tanker. The department shifted gears the way it did when a mass casualty call came in. Purposeful, fast, controlled noise replacing the ordinary noise. Dr. Vale materialized at the center of it, which was the thing he was genuinely good at. He became larger in a crisis, more directive, more visible, and people naturally oriented toward him the way plants orient toward heat. Bays 1 through 6 are primary, he announced. Darla, I need 2 nurses on each incoming critical. Respiratory standing by. We're going to triage on arrival. No pre-assignments. He looked around. Solis. She looked up from her clipboard. Get your cart out of Bay 2. We need the space. She moved the cart. The first ambulances arrived 14 minutes later. The casualties came in the pattern that mass casualty events always produce. A few criticals first, then a wave of moderates, then the walking wounded who had driven themselves and stood in the waiting room with glass still in their hair. The triage team met each gurney. Dr. Vale moved between patients, directing, ordering, making calls. The department absorbed the surge the way it had absorbed surges before, imperfectly but functionally. Megan stayed out of the clinical space. She resupplied equipment as it was used. She tracked what was being pulled and made sure replacement stock reached the right places before anyone had to ask for it. She worked at the edges of everything, invisible and useful. The tanker driver came in at 7:52. His name, they learned later, was Dale Corey. He was 51 years old, heavy-set, 15 years of commercial driving without a serious incident. The accident report suggested he had been on the highway for 6 hours before the crash, And the toxicology screen that arrived later would be complicated and confusing and would eventually explain a great deal. But at 7:52, they knew almost none of that. What they knew was that Dale Corey was alive when the paramedics loaded him, but had degraded en route, and that his vital signs on arrival were blood pressure 88/50, heart rate 128, respiratory rate 34 and labored, oxygen saturation 87% on high-flow oxygen, which was bad, which was very bad for a man whose only visible injuries were moderate road rash and a laceration on his forehead that had already stopped bleeding. Dr. Vale took one look at him and said, "Hypovolemic shock, possible internal bleed. Get him to Bay 1. We're opening a fast exam." The team moved. Megan was at the entrance of Bay 2, 15 feet away, replenishing the IV supply rack. She looked up when Corey's gurney came through. She watched the paramedic handoff. She saw his coloring. She saw the way his hands were positioned, fingers curled, slightly bluish at the nails despite the oxygen mask. She saw the dark staining around his mouth that the fluorescent lights were washing out and that nobody running alongside the gurney had stopped to look at. She set down the IV bags. She walked to the Bay 1 entrance and stood there, not entering, watching. The fast ultrasound took 4 minutes. Dr. Vale studied the screen and announced, "No significant free fluid. Could be retroperitoneal. Let's get a CT chest, abdomen, pelvis, stat." He looked at the nurse beside him. "Push 1 liter NS wide open. Type and cross. Get surgery on the phone." Megan said, "His fingernails are blue." Dr. Vale did not look at her. "I'm aware of the saturation reading." "It's not the saturation," she said. "The saturation is low because he's compensating. Look at his nail beds. That's not shock pattern. That's chemical." Now he looked at her, not at Corey, at her. "I'm sorry?" "The perioral staining," she said. "The breathing pattern, he's not splinting, he's obstructing. The nail coloration is specific. What was in the tanker?" "I don't need a supply nurse to—" "What was in the tanker?" she said again. Her voice had not changed. It was still quiet. But something in it had shifted, some quality of it, and the 2 nurses in the bay had both gone still. Did anyone ask the paramedics what the tanker was carrying? A beat of silence. One of the nurses said quietly, "I don't think we asked." Dr. Vale said, "It doesn't matter what the tanker was carrying if there's no exposure route." "He was in the cab for 6 hours, Megan said. "If there was any seal failure or valve leak, the cab is a closed environment." She took 1 step into the bay. "I need someone to call the first responders and ask them what that tanker was carrying, right now, before we move him to CT." "You need to step back," Dr. Vale said. His voice had dropped, which was more threatening than volume. "You are not clinical staff. You do not direct care in this department. If you interfere with this patient's treatment one more time, I will have you removed from this floor." Megan looked at him. She looked at Dale Corey. She looked at the dark staining around his mouth and the way his chest was moving and the particular color of his fingernails. She stepped back from the doorway. But she did not walk away. She stood at the nurses' station across the corridor and picked up the desk phone and called the paramedic dispatch coordinator and asked, in the same calm voice, what Dale Corey's tanker had been transporting. The answer came back in 40 seconds. She hung up the phone. She looked across the corridor at Dr. Vale, who was directing the CT transport. "The tanker was carrying acrolein," she said. The word landed in the corridor and sat there. One of the senior nurses, a man named Greg Tully, who had been in emergency medicine for 20 years, stopped moving. He looked at her. Then he looked at Corey. Acrolein. Industrial chemical. Used in manufacturing. Highly toxic. Attacks mucosal tissue, causes pulmonary edema, cardiac arrhythmia. Exposure in a closed environment over 6 hours. Lethal concentration can build without the exposed person's awareness, because at high enough concentrations it partially paralyzes the olfactory response. It does not show on a standard tox panel unless you are specifically looking for it. Its physical presentation mimics hypovolemic shock in the early stages, which is why it gets missed, Greg Tully said very quietly. "Oh no." Dr. Vale said, "What?" Megan was already moving. She had pulled gloves from the supply cart. She was pulling a gown. "He needs to be isolated," she said. "Everyone who's been in contact with him needs to be assessed for secondary exposure. We need to contact the hazmat team now, not after CT. The acrolein would have been on his clothing, his skin. Everyone who handled him in transport is at risk. That is not, Dr. Vale started. Do you want to verify it first, she said. She was already at the door of Bay 1. Run a methemoglobin level. It'll be elevated. It should come back in 8 minutes. You can move him to CT in 8 minutes if I'm wrong. She looked at him. Can you give me 8 minutes? The department had gone very quiet. Dr. Vale stared at her. There was a long moment, the kind of moment that reveals things about people, that strips away the performance of authority and shows what is underneath. Greg Tully was watching Dr. Vale the way you watch someone at a crossroads. The 2 nurses in Bay 1 were watching. Darla Brentwood had appeared at the edge of the corridor, watching. Dr. Vale said, "Order the methemoglobin level and get security up here." He meant the second part for Megan. She heard it. She kept moving. She had her gown on. She pulled a face shield from the supply cart, the specific kind rated for chemical splash, not the standard ER model, and she was back at the Bay 1 door. "I'm going in with him," she said. "You're not?" "Secondary exposure protocol requires isolation and active monitoring," she said. "You have 3 nurses in there without chemical PPE. You need to rotate them out and establish a clean perimeter." She pushed the door open. "Get your hazmat contact on the phone. Tell them possible acrolein exposure, adult male, 6-hour enclosed contact, arriving critical." She went in. The door closed behind her. Dr. Vale stood in the corridor for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then he turned to Greg Tully and said, "Get me the methemoglobin level." His voice was strange, flat in a way it hadn't been before. "And call security." Greg Tully moved toward the lab phone. He did not call security. Inside Bay 1, Dale Corey's oxygen saturation had dropped to 83%. His heart rate was climbing. The monitor showed a rhythm that was trying to become something worse. Megan assessed him with her hands first, palpating his abdomen, checking his lymph nodes, looking at his conjunctivitis. She leaned close to his face and breathed through her nose carefully, then pulled back. She checked his pupils. She looked at the exact angle of his jaw and the way his neck muscles were working to assist his breathing. She had seen this before, not in an emergency room, in a place where there were no CT machines and no labs, and the methemoglobin level would come back whenever the helicopter arrived, which was sometimes never. She pulled a specific medication from the crash cart drawer. Methylene blue, standard treatment for methemoglobinemia. She checked the dose, checked the concentration, checked Corey's weight from the paramedic sheet. She prepared the injection. She did not administer it yet. That required an order. She was not a prescribing clinician. She was a supply nurse. Those were the rules. But she had the medication drawn and ready, and she had the dose calculated, and she stood beside his gurney with it in her hand, and she talked to him, because he was still conscious, barely, eyes half open, and she had learned somewhere she was not going to think about right now, that people in chemical distress do better when someone is talking to them. "Dale," she said, "my name is Megan. I'm a nurse. You were in your cab for a long time today. We think you may have been breathing something that made you sick. We're going to fix that. I need you to try to breathe slowly for me, in through your nose if you can, out through your mouth. Can you do that?" His eyes moved to her face. He tried. It was labored and incomplete, but he tried. "Good," she said. "You're doing good. Keep doing that." The methemoglobin result came through the Bay's computer terminal at 8:09, 17 minutes after Dale Corey had arrived. Methemoglobin level, 38%. Normal is under 1%. The door opened. Greg Tully looked in, read the screen, looked at Megan, and said nothing. He went back out. She heard Dr. Vale's voice in the corridor, changed now. Still authoritative, but directed differently, issuing the right orders, calling hazmat, calling pharmacy. She heard him redirect the nurses, heard him establish the clean perimeter she had described. She heard him do, correctly and quickly, everything that needed to happen. She did not hear him come to the Bay 1 door. Pharmacy sent up the methylene blue order, a physician order, Dr. Vale's order, correct dose, correct concentration. 7 minutes later. A nurse in full chemical PPE came in to administer it. Megan stepped aside. She watched the medication go in. She watched Dale Corey's saturation on the monitor. 83, 83, 84. A long pause. 85. She breathed out slowly. His heart rate began to ease. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just the slow, reluctant retreat of a number that had been climbing towards something terrible. 134, 129, 126. The rhythm on the monitor stopped threatening and settled into something workable. His eyes, which had been rolling, focused. Briefly, shakily, they found her face. She said, "You're going to be okay." She did not know that for certain. He needed an ICU and probably a ventilator and a toxicologist, and the next 24 hours were going to be serious. But his trajectory had changed. The worst thing had been intercepted. Outside Bay 1, the corridor was a different place than it had been 20 minutes ago. The hazmat team was en route. The paramedics who had transported Corey had been pulled aside for exposure assessment. The two nurses who had been in Bay 1 without adequate PPE were being evaluated. Dr. Vale was on the phone, his voice controlled and correct, and the department was functioning, and the mass casualty surge was still being managed in the other bays. It looked from a distance like things were under control, but the nurses who had been in the corridor when it happened, Greg Tully, and a travel nurse named Priya, who had only been there 6 weeks, and a nursing student whose name nobody would remember afterward, but who would remember this day for the rest of her life. They all knew that the department's competence in this moment was built on something Dr. Vale had almost refused to listen to, from someone Dr. Vale had spent 11 months making sure everyone knew didn't matter. Darla Brentwood was at the nurse's station. She was looking at the closed door of Bay 1. Her expression was not readable. Greg Tully came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Darla said, "Where did she even learn that?" Greg said, "I don't know." The acrolein thing, the methemoglobin level, the dose she had already drawn up. Darla's voice was flat. "Where does a supply nurse learn that?" Greg Tully had been in emergency medicine for 20 years. He had worked with a lot of people. He had a decent instinct for what people were, even when they were trying not to show it. He had been watching Megan Solis for 11 months, with the particular low-level attention you pay to people who don't make sense yet. "I don't think she's a supply nurse," he said. Darla looked at him. "I think she's something else," he said. "And I don't think we've seen it yet." Petite. The mass casualty surge ran for 4 more hours. Megan came out of Bay 1 at 9:15 after Dale Corey had been stabilized and transferred to the ICU, with a toxicology team managing his care. She removed her PPE in the decontamination area, disposed of it properly, washed her hands, and went back to the supply cart. She picked up her clipboard. She resumed her inventory round. Dr. Vale found her in Bay 4 at 9:40, restocking the suture kit drawer. He came in and stood behind her for a moment before he said anything. She knew he was there. She continued what she was doing. "The methemoglobin level confirmed it," he said. Finally. "I know," she said. "The hazmat team is saying his cab had a valve seal failure, slow leak, 6 hours. He paused. "The paramedics are being monitored. 2 of them are showing early symptoms." She nodded. She had expected that. "The nurses in Bay 1 are fine," he said. "The exposure window was short enough." "Good," she said. Another pause. She could feel him working up to something. She had been in enough situations with men like Dr. Vale to know what that working up felt like. There was the moment of acknowledgement, and then the pivot that tried to reclaim the thing the acknowledgement had cost. "You should have come to me directly," he said, instead of ordering staff around and making unilateral decisions about isolation. She turned around. She looked at him. "I did come to you directly," she said. "You ordered security." His jaw tightened. "The protocol here is that clinical decisions—" "I know the protocol," she said. "I didn't make a clinical decision. I identified a pattern and asked you to verify it. You were going to put him in a CT scanner." She held his gaze. "A CT scanner does not treat acrolein poisoning. It would have been the last scan he ever had." The pause that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. Dr. Vale said, "I'll need a full incident report from you." "Of course," she said, "and I'll be reviewing whether your conduct today was within your scope of practice." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not anger, not hurt, something older than that. "File whatever you need to file," she said. She turned back to the suture kit drawer. He stood there another moment. Then he left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor. She finished the drawer. She moved to the next one. Her hands were perfectly steady. That was the part people who had been watching from the corridor would talk about later. Not the diagnosis, not the methylene blue drawn up and ready, not the thing she had said to Dr. Vale when he came back. They would talk about the hands. Steady through all of it. The whole morning. Not the steadiness of someone who wasn't afraid. The steadiness of someone who had been afraid in much worse places and had learned that fear and function were not mutually exclusive. She finished her inventory round by noon. She ate lunch alone in the break room, a sandwich she had brought from home, water from the fountain. She read nothing. She looked at the wall. At 12:45, the charge desk called down from administration. Dr. Vale had filed an incident report alleging that Megan Solis had exceeded her clinical scope of practice, interfered with physician-directed care, and created confusion during a mass casualty event. He was requesting a review of her employment status. The woman at the charge desk delivered this message to Megan over the break room phone with the particular careful neutrality of someone who was not sure which side of something they were on. Megan said, "Thank you." She hung up. She looked at the wall again for a moment. Then she picked up her phone, her personal cell, not the hospital line, and made a call. It rang twice before someone answered. She said 3 words. 3 words that meant something specific to whoever was on the other end, because the response was immediate, because there was no small talk, because whoever was on the other end of that call knew exactly who they were talking to and what 3 words like that from this particular person meant. She hung up. She finished her water. She went back to work. At 4:15 that afternoon, Dale Corey's wife arrived at the hospital. She had driven 3 hours from the coast, gotten the call in the middle of a workday, driven without stopping. She was escorted to the ICU. She sat beside her husband's bed and held his hand and was told by the toxicologist on duty that her husband was going to survive, that it would take time, that the prognosis was good, that someone in the ER had caught it early enough to make that true. She asked who. The toxicologist hesitated. "A nurse," he said, "on the emergency department floor." She asked if she could speak to the nurse. He said he would try to find out. He asked at the ER charge desk. The charge desk called down to supply. The answer that came back was that Megan Solis had completed her shift and signed out at 4 o'clock, 15 minutes earlier. She was gone. Nobody knew where she had gone. Nobody had her home address on file, which was unusual, and nobody had thought to notice that before. Her emergency contact was a number with a non-local area code that nobody had ever had occasion to call, but the incident report was filed, and it was working its way through administration. And Greg Tully, who was starting his night shift at 5 o'clock, was sitting at the nurse's station drinking terrible coffee and staring at the Bay 1 door that was still slightly marked with the decontamination tape, thinking about something he had noticed at 8:09 when he had come to the Bay 1 door to show Megan the methemoglobin result. He had looked through the small window in the door before opening it. He had seen her standing beside Corey's gurney, medication drawn and ready. And she had been talking to him, quietly, steadily. The way you talk to someone when you are trying to keep them anchored to the world. And the thing Greg Tully kept coming back to, the thing he could not stop turning over, was the way she was standing. Not the way a supply nurse stands beside a gurney. Not the way any nurse he had ever seen stands beside a gurney. The way a person stands who has done this before in conditions he could not quite imagine. The weight evenly distributed. The hands precisely placed. The absolute economy of every movement. The way a person stands when a situation that would break other people is, for them, a version of ordinary. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. No name, no context. Just a number. A case number format he didn't recognize. Letters and digits, federal style. He stared at it. Then he got up and walked to the window that overlooked the parking lot. The lot was emptying out with the shift change. Nurses and techs walking to their cars. The usual end-of-day traffic. But there was a vehicle at the far edge of the lot that had been there all afternoon and that he had not looked at directly until now. Dark. Government plates. Parked in the shadow of the building. Not moving. Waiting. Greg Tully stood at the window for a long time. The vehicle did not move. It sat at the edge of the lot with its engine off and its lights dark, and the longer he looked at it, the more certain he became that it was not a coincidence. Not a visitor who had parked far from the entrance, not a pharmaceutical rep waiting out a meeting. It had government plates, the kind that were technically civilian but weren't, the kind you learned to recognize if you had spent enough time around certain institutions. He had a brother-in-law who worked federal procurement. He knew what those plates looked like. He looked down at his phone again. The case number format, the letters and digits. He had worked in emergency medicine for 20 years, and he had never received a text like that from anyone. He put the phone in his pocket. He went back to the nurse's station and picked up his coffee and drank it and pretended to review the night shift handoff notes. But he was not reading them. He was thinking about Megan Solis and her steady hands and the 3 words she had said into her phone in the break room, which he had not heard but which Priya had, because Priya had been in the hallway outside and the break room door was thin. Priya had told him about it 20 minutes ago, quietly, while they were both pretending to organize the supply cabinet near Bay 3. 3 words. Valkyrie is active. He had not known what to do with that then. He did not know what to do with it now. He put it in the category of things he would think about later and focused on the handoff, on the patients in the department, on the work that was in front of him and that he understood. The night shift was quieter than the day had been. The mass-casualty surge had settled into the slower rhythm of follow-up calls, documentation, family liaison work. 2 of the patients from the highway accident were still in critical care but stable. Dale Corey was on a ventilator in the ICU, sedated, his numbers moving in the right direction. At 6:30, a hospital administrator named Richard Fossey came down to the ER. Greg Tully had seen Richard Fossey exactly 4 times in 3 years, which told you something about how often hospital administration visited the emergency department. He was a careful, neat man in his late 50s, the kind of administrator who had risen by being good at managing upward and non-committal downward, and his presence in the department at 6:30 on a Thursday evening meant something had reached a level that required his physical body to be somewhere. He went directly to the charge desk and asked for the incident report that Dr. Vale had filed. He read it at the desk. He did not sit. He stood and read it, and his face did not change much. But Greg Tully, watching from the nurse's station, could see the small movements, the slight tightening around the eyes, the controlled pause before he turned the page. When he finished, he looked up and asked where Dr. Vale was. Dr. Vale was in his office. He had been in his office since 5 o'clock, which was unusual. He normally moved through the department until 6 o'clock at least. Richard Fossey went to Dr. Vale's office and closed the door. Greg Tully could not hear the conversation. He could not even hear the tone of it, because the offices on the administrative side of the department were built with that specific institutional insularity that ensured nobody in the hallway could tell whether the person inside was being praised or destroyed. He found out later from Darla Brentwood, who had found out from the charge nurse on the administrative floor, who had found out from the assistant who sat outside Fossey's office, that the conversation had been brief, that Fossey had asked 3 questions, that Dr. Vale had answered all 3 questions with the same answer, which was a version of "I followed appropriate protocol," and the supply nurse overstepped her scope, and that Fossey had looked at him for a moment and then said that the hospital's legal team was reviewing the incident report in the context of the patient outcome and that Dr. Vale should not discuss the case with anyone until that review was complete. Then Fossey had left. Dr. Vale had not emerged from his office until 7 o'clock. None of this reached Megan Solis that evening because Megan Solis was not in the hospital. Nobody knew where she was. She was in an apartment on the east side of Delwood City that most people who knew her at work would have been surprised by, though they could not have said exactly why. It was a 3rd-floor unit in a building that was unremarkable from the outside. Brick, 4 stories, the kind of building that exists in the older parts of mid-sized cities and holds its tenants without drawing attention. The apartment itself was spare, not sparse in the curated way of people who wanted to project minimalism, but spare the way spaces are when the person living in them has not prioritized accumulation. There was furniture that functioned. There were books, a specific kind of book, technical manuals and toxicology references, and one well-worn copy of something in a language that was not English, the spine cracked from years of use. There was a kitchen that showed signs of actual cooking, and a second bedroom that had been repurposed as something between an office and a prep space, with a large corkboard on one wall that held maps and documents that she took down and turned face in whenever anyone came to the door, which was almost never. She sat at the kitchen table in a t-shirt and dark pants with a glass of water. She was not drinking, and a phone that had been buzzing intermittently since 3 o'clock that afternoon and that she had been answering selectively. The call at 3 o'clock had been the one she had made. The 3 words. The response had been 8 words, delivered by a voice she had not heard in 14 months. Understood. We're moving. Stay visible until morning. Then the line had gone dead. Stay visible until morning meant do not deviate. Do not run. Do not resolve anything herself. Let the machinery that had been set in motion run. She was not good at that. She had never been good at that. 14 months ago, she had been good at it under different conditions, under conditions where the machinery was one she controlled, where stay in position meant something tactical that she understood. This was different. This was waiting in a kitchen in a hospital city while someone she trusted was moving pieces she could not see. And the difference between those two kinds of waiting was the difference between a controlled hold and being held. She drank the water. She picked up the phone and checked the overnight talks update that the ICU had sent. She was not supposed to have access to that, technically, but Greg Tully had quietly added her to the distribution list 3 months ago after the second time she had caught something in a supply audit that turned out to be clinically significant, and nobody had questioned it. Dale Corey's methemoglobin level had dropped to 12%. His oxygenation was improving on the vent. The toxicologist's note said, prognosis revised to favorable. She set the phone down. She looked at the corkboard through the open door of the second bedroom, at the maps and the documents turned face in. She had spent 11 months building something in that room. Information she was not supposed to have, connections she was not supposed to be drawing, a picture that had been assembling itself piece by piece in the space between her supply inventory rounds and her quiet lunches and her careful, watchful shifts at a hospital that thought she was nobody. Harlow County General was not random. She had not ended up there by accident. She got up and went to the corkboard and turned the documents face out, one by one. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the sleet having finally committed to rain overnight. Megan came in at 7. She signed in at the nurse's station. She pulled her assignment sheet. She went to the supply cart. The department had the post-surge quality of an engine that had been run hard and not yet cooled. Everything still slightly taut, people moving with the residual efficiency that mass casualty events produce and that dissipates within 24 hours into ordinary friction. The patients from the highway accident were distributed through the floors above. The ER itself was back to its normal overcrowded state, running at 109% capacity, and the staff was absorbing the familiar baseline of too many patients and not enough of everything. Darla Brentwood watched Megan from the moment she walked in, not hostile, or not only hostile, something more complicated. The watching was different from the watching of 11 months of accumulated dismissal. It had the quality of reassessment, which was not the same as acceptance, but was at least motion in that direction. Dr. Vale arrived at 7:30. He came in through the side entrance, which was not his usual entrance. He went directly to his office without stopping at the charge desk, which was very much not his usual routine. The 2 charge nurses exchanged a look that Greg Tully, coming off the overnight shift, caught on his way to sign out. He stopped at the nurse's station. He was tired in the way that 20-year emergency medicine veterans are tired, not complaining about it, not performing it, just carrying it. He had dark circles and his coffee cup was already empty. He looked at Megan, who was at the far end of the department with her cart, and he looked at the closed door of Dr. Vale's office, and he made a calculation. "How's Corey?" he asked the overnight charge nurse. 12% methemoglobin as of 4 a.m. They might extubate tomorrow if he keeps trending. Greg nodded. He poured fresh coffee. He did not leave. At 8:15, Richard Fossey came back to the department. He was not alone this time. He had 2 people with him, a woman Greg did not recognize, in a suit that read legal, and a man in a hospital administrator's lanyard, who was not from Harlow County General, but from the District Health Authority, whose logo Greg recognized from the quarterly regulatory reports that nobody in the ER read, but that were distributed to staff anyway. The 3 of them went into Dr. Vale's office. This time Greg could hear something. Not words, not even tone, just the fact of multiple voices at once. The acoustic texture of a conversation that was not going well for at least one person in the room. Megan kept working. She had moved to the medication cabinet on the east wall and was conducting a controlled substance count, which required a witness, and Priya was standing beside her initialing the log entries. Neither of them appeared to be paying attention to Dr. Vale's office. But Priya was very much paying attention to Dr. Vale's office. She said under her breath without looking up from the log, "Is this about yesterday?" Megan said, "Initial the ketamine count." "That's not a no." Priya initialed the ketamine count. The meeting in Dr. Vale's office ran 35 minutes. When it ended, Fossey and the two others came out first. The woman in the suit had a folder that she had not had going in. The District Health Authority administrator was writing something on his phone. Fossey's face was the controlled face of a man who had just agreed to something he did not completely like but understood was necessary. Dr. Vale came out behind them. He looked different. Not diminished, not yet, but something in the construction of him had shifted slightly, the way a building looks when you can see that one of its load-bearing elements has been questioned. He walked to the charge desk and stood there for a moment, and then turned and looked down the department to where Megan was finishing the medication count. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, loudly enough to carry, "Solis, administration office. Now." Priya's pen stopped moving. Megan closed the medication log. She handed it to Priya. She walked the length of the department toward the administrative corridor without hurrying, without looking at anyone who was looking at her, which was most of the people in the department because the quality of Dr. Vale's voice had pulled attention the way a dropped instrument pulls attention, the sharp sound that makes every head turn. She walked into the administrative corridor. Richard Foss was waiting. The woman in the suit was waiting. Dr. Vale came in behind Megan and closed the door. Fossey said, "Ms. Solis, I'm Richard Fossey, Deputy Director of Operations. I want to assure you that this conversation is not punitive. We're conducting a review of yesterday's events, and we need your account of what happened." Megan looked at him. "All right. Dr. Vale has submitted an incident report alleging that your conduct during the mass-casualty event exceeded your clinical scope of practice and interfered with physician-directed care. Can you walk me through your actions from the time the tanker driver arrived?" She did. She was precise. She used the correct terminology, the correct timeline, the correct sequence of clinical reasoning. She did not editorialize. She did not say, "and Dr. Vale was going to kill him." She said what she had observed, what she had inferred, what she had done, and in what order, and why each step was consistent with the scope of a nursing professional identifying a pattern and escalating appropriately. When she finished, Fossey said, "You identified acrolein toxicity from visual assessment alone before any lab confirmation. I identified a presentation that was inconsistent with the assumed diagnosis and requested verification. Where did you develop that clinical knowledge?" She looked at him. "Prior work experience." "Which was?" "Trauma settings." "Can you be more specific?" She looked at him with the same expression she had been using on questions like this for 11 months. Not evasive, not hostile, just finished. "I'd prefer not to at this time." The woman in the suit wrote something. Dr. Vale said from the corner of the room where he had positioned himself, "She has no documented clinical credentials beyond her nursing license. Whatever she learned outside any verifiable context. My nursing license is active and in good standing," Megan said. "The patient survived. The secondary exposure risk was contained. The paramedics who were assessed showed early symptoms that were caught because of the protocol I described." She looked at Fossey. "I'm not sure what we're reviewing." Fossey said, Dr. Vale's report was filed before the methemoglobin result came back," she said. "You can check the timestamps." The room was quiet. Fossey looked at the woman in the suit. Some communication happened between them without words. Then Fossey said, "Ms. Solis, effective today, we're placing you on administrative reassignment pending the outcome of the review. You'll maintain your pay and benefits, but you won't be on the floor." She had expected this. She had known, from the moment she walked out of Bay 1 yesterday morning, that this was where it was going. The machinery of institutions moved predictably when you threatened their structure, not toward justice, not first, toward stability, toward protection of the people who had been inside the walls the longest. She said, "I understand. You're not required to vacate the premises immediately. You can gather your personal belongings from your locker at your convenience." "I'll do that now," she said. She stood. She nodded to Fossey, not subservient, not hostile, just acknowledged. She walked to the door. Dr. Vale said, For what it's worth, she stopped. I think you're competent, he said. The words came out like something he had been rehearsing and still wasn't sure about. What you did yesterday was not nothing, but this department has a chain of command for a reason. You went around it. She turned and looked at him. I went to you first, she said. You ordered security. She left. Her locker held almost nothing. A jacket, a water bottle, a small notebook that she put in her jacket pocket. She was done in 4 minutes. Greg Tully was in the locker room corridor when she came out. He was still in his overnight shift clothes. He had not left. He said, They're pulling you off the floor. Yes? Because of yesterday. Yes. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who wanted to say several things and was deciding which of them would actually help. He settled on, the paramedics they assessed, 2 of them had elevated carboxyhemoglobin levels. They would have been sick by tonight if nobody caught it. I know, she said. You saved probably 4 people yesterday. Corey and 3 responders. The treatment saved them. Megan. She looked at him. I've been doing this 20 years, he said. I know what people look like when they've been trained in controlled situations. And I know what they look like when they've been trained in situations that don't have any control at all. He paused. You've been in rooms where people were dying and there was nobody else there. She held his gaze for a moment. Get some rest, she said. You've been here 14 hours. She walked down the corridor. He watched her go. He thought about the vehicle in the parking lot, dark and government-plated and waiting. He thought about Valkyrie as active. He thought about the way she walked, the same way she stood, that economy of movement that was not trained in any nursing program he had ever heard of. He went back to the nurse's station and sat down and tried to write his overnight notes and found that he could not concentrate on them. At 10 o'clock, he got another text from the unknown number. This one said, Tell no one. Be at your department at 1400. Yeah, the morning passed. Megan did not go home. She drove to the east side of the city, to a diner that had been open since 1987 and that served coffee that was either terrible or excellent, depending on what you needed it to be. She sat in a booth by the window and drank 2 cups and looked at her phone and waited. At 11:30, a man sat down across from her. He was in his 60s, compact, with the particular kind of physical presence that does not announce itself but fills a space. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, plain shirt, but civilian clothes sat on him the way a costume sits on an actor, technically correct and fundamentally wrong. He set a thin folder on the table and put his hands flat beside it. You activated the signal, he said. It was necessary, she said. Walk me through it. She did, more quickly than she had for Fosse, with different emphasis. Not the clinical sequence, but the context. What she had seen in the ER that had finally made the signal necessary. Not just Dale Corey, not just the acrolane. The other things. The things she had been documenting in the second bedroom of her apartment for 11 months. The man listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he looked at the folder. You've been building this the whole time, he said. That was the assignment. The assignment was observation and documentation, not exposure. The situation required intervention. The situation required you to maintain cover. The patient would have died. He looked at her. Yes, he said. He would have. He said it without apology and without judgment, the way you say things when you have been in operations long enough to understand that cover and casualties exist in genuine tension and that neither answer is clean. What's in your apartment? 14 months of documentation, billing records, patient outcome patterns, pharmaceutical procurement logs, staff scheduling anomalies. There's a systematic fraud operation running through that hospital's supply chain. It's been running for at least 3 years. The scope is larger than the initial referral suggested. How much larger? It touches 4 facilities in the district. She looked at him. And it's connected to the pharmaceutical procurement network we flagged in the original brief. He was quiet for a moment. How solid is it? Solid enough that I activated the signal. He picked up the folder. He set it back down without opening it. He was thinking in the way that people think when they are rapidly calculating consequences. Not panicking, not excited, just running scenarios with the professional calm of someone who has done that calculation many times before. They've pulled you off the floor, he said. This morning. That complicates the timeline. I know. We needed another 6 to 8 weeks for the federal warrant package. I know. She looked at the coffee cup. Khoury would have been dead in 20 minutes. The paramedics would have been hospitalized by tonight. The containment failure would have exposed the hazmat response team. She looked at the man across from her. I made a call. He looked at her for a long moment. You always make a call, he said. There was something in it that was not entirely criticism. Yes, she said. He pushed the folder across the table. The team is moving up the timeline. We have assets positioned. There's a meeting scheduled at the hospital tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon. Board of Directors, District Health Authority, Dr. Vale's legal representation. The review of your conduct is the stated agenda. He paused. It will not be the actual agenda. She looked at the folder but did not open it. What do you need from me? She said. Be there, he said, and bring everything from the apartment. She nodded. He stood. He left money on the table for the coffee she had not ordered for him. He walked out of the diner and into the gray morning and did not look back. She sat for a moment. She opened the folder. The first page was a personnel file. She had seen versions of it before, the summary, the framework, but not this complete. Not with the names that were now on the third page, institutional connections that confirmed what she had been assembling from procurement logs and scheduling anomalies. The fraud was not incidental. It was structural. And it had a face, a specific face. Someone in the hospital who was not Dr. Vale. Dr. Vale was a problem, but Dr. Vale was not the architecture. Someone who had been using the institutional cover of Harlow County General for 3 years to run a pharmaceutical diversion operation that had reached 4 facilities and generated an estimated $6 million in fraudulent billing. She closed the folder. She finished her coffee. She drove back to the apartment and spent the afternoon putting the documents in order. At 1:45 the next day, she walked back into Harlow County General. She had the documents in a bag. Not the originals, copies. The originals were somewhere she was not going to identify yet, with someone who was not in this building. She had her copy of the notification letter from hospital administration. She had her nursing license documentation and her personnel file, which she had requested and received by email that morning without incident. The lobby was its normal afternoon self. The information desk with its rotating volunteer, the elevator bank, the pharmacy pickup line, the corridor leading to the ER that she had walked several hundred times in 11 months. She knew the rhythms of this building. She knew when the nursing shift change pulled people off the floor and when the administrative staff took their 2 o'clock coffee run. She knew the camera blind spots in the corridors that were used and the ones that were not, and where the loading dock camera had been broken for 6 weeks and nobody had fixed it because the maintenance request was sitting in a backlog that had nothing to do with maintenance. She knew where the pharmaceutical supply records were stored. She had been restocking shelves 3 floors from them for 11 months. She went to the 3rd floor, which was not the floor she had been told to go to. She had been told to go to the 4th floor conference room for the 2 o'clock meeting. She had 20 minutes. She went to the pharmacy administration office, which was locked, which she had known it would be, and she used a key that she was not supposed to have, a copy made from a code-cut request she had generated 11 months ago as part of a supply logistics assessment that had been approved and then forgotten. And she went inside. She went to the filing cabinet against the back wall. She pulled the 3rd drawer. She found what she was looking for in 7 minutes, which was 3 minutes longer than she had planned for, and which meant she arrived at the 4th floor conference room at 2:03, slightly out of breath but not showing it, with a set of documents that had not been in her bag when she walked into the building. The conference room was already full. Richard Foss was there, the woman in the suit from yesterday. 2 people she did not recognize who had the look of outside legal counsel. Dr. Vale, in the corner he seemed to prefer. A man she recognized from the District Health Authority, and one other person, sitting at the far end of the table with the posture of someone who belonged to the room and had belonged to it for a long time. Howard Blass, Director of Pharmaceutical Services, Harlow County General. She had been building a file on Howard Blass for 11 months. He looked at her when she walked in. There was nothing in his expression that was remarkable. He was a man in his mid-50s, heavy-set, pleasant-faced, the kind of institutional presence that reads as competent and unremarkable, and that people have learned not to look at too carefully because he had made sure of that, because that was the specific skill he had developed. Not intelligence, not charm, but the ability to generate comfortable invisibility. He looked at her. She looked at him. She sat down. Fossey said, "Thank you for coming, Miss Solis. As I mentioned in the notification, this meeting is to present the findings of the administrative review and discuss next steps regarding your employment status." "Of course," she said. She set her bag on the table. She did not open it yet. Fossey began the review. He went through the incident report. He went through the timeline. He went through the patient outcome data that had come back overnight, Dale Corey's improving numbers, the paramedic assessments, the hazmat team's after-action report. His presentation was careful and deliberately balanced, the presentation of a man who had been instructed by legal counsel to present both sides with equivalent weight. The problem was that the evidence was not balanced. Foss knew it. The woman in the suit knew it. The outside legal counsel, reading the outcome data, had gone slightly still in the way lawyers go still when they realize the argument they were hired to make is not going to hold. Dr. Vale knew it too. He sat in his corner and he was very quiet, and Megan had enough experience with men like him to know what that quiet cost him. Howard Blass knew nothing, or appeared to know nothing, and watched the proceedings with the pleasant, neutral face of someone who was in this room on a separate matter and was waiting for his relevance to arrive. Fossey concluded his presentation and looked at Megan. "Ms. Solis, do you have anything you'd like to add to the record?" She said, "Yes." She opened her bag. She set the pharmacy administration documents on the table. She said, "I'd like to add a billing discrepancy report covering pharmaceutical procurement at this facility over the past 34 months. It documents approximately $2.2 million in fraudulent purchase orders across 11 controlled substance categories. The purchase orders were approved by the Director of Pharmaceutical Services and routed through a shell vendor that was incorporated 8 months before the discrepancies began." She looked at the documents. "I have the shell company registration. I have the bank routing information. I have the approval signatures." She looked up. "I also have the same documentation for 3 other facilities in this district. The total across all 4 facilities is approximately $6 million. The room had gone completely silent. She looked at Howard Blass. He was not pleasant and neutral anymore. He was looking at the documents on the table, and the color had left his face, and his hands, which had been flat and still, were now gripping the armrests of his chair in a way that he was not doing on purpose. Fossey said very carefully, "Miss Solis, where did you obtain these documents?" She said, "Pharmacy administration, 3rd floor, filing cabinet C, drawer 3. She looked at him. "I have authorization." She reached into the bag and produced a second set of papers. "Federal investigative authorization. The review of this facility's pharmaceutical supply chain has been ongoing for 14 months. The woman in the suit said, "What?" The door to the conference room opened. 3 people walked in. 2 of them were in the dark jackets and restrained professional clothing of federal investigators, carrying credentials that they opened and held up. The third was the man from the diner, in the same civilian clothes, and he walked to the end of the table and stood there and looked at Howard Blass with the specific expression of someone who has been building toward this room for a very long time. Blass pushed back from the table. He did not get far. One of the federal investigators was already at the door. The man from the diner said, "Howard Blass, we have a warrant." And somewhere 2 floors below, in the emergency department that Megan Solis had stalked and cleaned and watched and worked for 11 months, Greg Tully was standing at the nurse's station at exactly 2 o'clock as the unknown numbers text had instructed, and he was watching 4 federal vehicles pull into the hospital parking lot, and he was watching people in dark jackets cross the lobby, and he was watching the hospital's institutional certainty, the arrangement of authority and dismissal and comfortable blindness that he had been part of for 3 years, begin to come apart at the seams. His phone buzzed. New message, same unknown number. Look at your email. Personnel file update, Solis M. Read the full record. He opened his email. He found the file. He began to read. He got 3 paragraphs in and stopped. He read those 3 paragraphs again. He set his phone down on the nurse's station counter and looked at the lobby where the federal investigators were still moving, and then he looked at the corridor that led to the 4th floor conference room, and something in his face changed that he could not have named, but that Priya, standing 6 feet away, immediately noticed. She said, "Greg, what is it?" He did not answer right away. He was still looking at the corridor. He was thinking about 11 months, about supply carts and inventory rounds. about the steady hands and the medication drawn and ready before the order arrived, about Valkyrie as active. He thought about the classified call sign that was in the personnel file he had just opened. He thought about what that call sign meant, what operations it was attached to, what the unredacted portions of the record described about the kinds of rooms and conditions and stakes this woman had been trained in. He thought about Dr. Vale saying, "Stay in your lane in a hospital corridor," to a woman who had spent 7 years operating in conditions that would have put Dr. Vale on the floor in 15 minutes. He thought about 11 months of supply carts and silence, and Darla Brentwood's voice in the break room saying she thinks she's better than everyone. He said quietly, to no one in particular, she wasn't hiding because she was ashamed of something. Priya said, "What?" He looked at her. "She was undercover," he said. Priya stared at him. "Undercover," she said. The word came out flat, like she was testing its weight and finding it improbable. "She's a supply nurse." "No," Greg said. "She's not." He was still looking at his phone. The personnel file was 3 pages, and the first 2 pages were the standard Harlow County General Employment Record. License number, hire date, assignment history, performance evaluations that were so neutral they read like they had been generated by someone deliberately calibrating for invisibility. But the 3rd page was different. The 3rd page had a header that he had seen on exactly one other document in his life. A document that had come through the hospital's credentialing office 4 years ago, attached to a locum physician who had worked the ER for 2 weeks before quietly not coming back. And that header meant federal affiliation. And the federal affiliation was attached to a unit designation that he did not recognize and that the document itself did not explain. Below that, a name. Not Megan Solis. A different name with Megan Solis listed as an authorized alias. Below that, a classification level that the document referenced but did not reproduce, with a notation that said full record available only upon appropriate authorization request through designated federal channel. Below that, a list of operational assignments, redacted, every single one. Black bars through dates and locations and descriptions, so thorough that the only thing visible was the number of them, and the number was not small. And at the very bottom, a single line that was not redacted, possibly because whoever had prepared this summary document had made a mistake, or possibly because someone had decided it needed to be there. Callsign, Valkyrie. Operational status, active. Priya read over his shoulder. He heard her breath change. "Active," she said. "Active," he said. They both looked at the corridor that led to the elevator bank that led to the 4th floor. Priya said, "What does active mean?" Greg said, "I think it means she's not done." The 4th floor conference room had become a different kind of space in the 3 minutes since the federal investigators walked in. Howard Blass had not stood up again after the initial push from the table. He sat with his hands folded on the surface in front of him, which was the posture of a man who had made a rapid internal calculation and arrived at cooperation is the only remaining option. His face had reorganized itself from pleasantly neutral to something that was trying very hard to remain composed and not entirely succeeding. There was a tremor in his jaw that he was working to control. His eyes moved between the investigators and the documents on the table and back with the particular darting quality of someone running contingency scenarios and finding each one worse than the last. The woman in the suit, Harlow County General's in-house legal counsel, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been doing institutional healthcare law for 18 years and had a reputation for being difficult to rattle, was rattled. She had her pen in her hand and was not writing anything. She was looking at the federal credentials with the expression of someone doing a fast, unhappy assessment of liability. Richard Foss had gone very still. He was not looking at Blass. He was looking at the documents Megan had set on the table, the pharmaceutical procurement records, the shell company registration, the approval signatures, and he was doing the particular arithmetic that administrators do when they realize something has been happening in their institution that they did not know about, and that their not knowing is not going to protect them from anything. Dr. Vale sat in his corner with his arms crossed and said nothing. His expression was unreadable. That was not unusual. Vale had a practiced professional face for situations that required containment, but there was something underneath it that Greg Tully, had he been in the room, would have recognized. The same quality he had seen in Vale yesterday when the methemoglobin result came back. The quality of someone whose read of a situation has been proven wrong and who has not yet figured out what to do with that. The man from the diner, whose name Megan had noted in 11 months of documentation, was Daniel Ware, and whose official designation was Senior Investigator with the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, which was the federal body that investigated healthcare fraud, which was what this was, stood at the end of the table and let the room absorb what had just happened. He was good at that. He had the investigator's patience for the moment after the reveal, the understanding that silence is its own kind of pressure, and that most people, given enough silence after a shock, will begin to fill it in ways that are useful. Howard Blass was the first to fill it. "I want to speak to an attorney," he said. "You have that right," Ware said. "We'll pause this meeting and arrange for—" "I have my own attorney," Blass said, "not the hospital's." Sandra Okafor's expression confirmed that she had already reached the same conclusion about whose interest she was and was not representing in this room. Ware nodded to one of the other investigators, who moved to the door and held it. He looked at Fossey. "Mr. Fossey, we're going to need the Pharmaceutical Services Office's sealed pending review of additional records. Your cooperation with that process will be noted." Fossey said, "Of course." His voice was flat. He was already in damage control mode, which was where men like Fossey went when the situation required it. He would cooperate fully. He would make himself available. He would position the hospital as a victim of Blass's operation rather than a complicit structure, which was the version that would best protect the institution and his position in it, and which was, as far as Megan knew, not entirely inaccurate. Fossey had not known what Blass was doing, which was the point of doing it the way Blass had done it. She stood. She picked up her bag. She left the pharmacy documents on the table. Ware looked at her. A small thing. Not a nod, not a signal, just the particular quality of a glance between two people who have been working toward the same thing for a long time. She walked out of the conference room. She took the stairs down, not the elevator. She always took the stairs. Bum. The third floor was quiet. In the way institutional floors go quiet when something significant is happening on another floor and the information hasn't reached this one yet. She walked past the nursing station, past the patient rooms with their beeping monitors and the ambient noise of an occupied hospital afternoon. She walked to the pharmacy administration office and locked it again with the key she was not supposed to have. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Her hands were not entirely steady. That was the thing nobody saw, usually. The shaking came after, never during. During was fine. During she was exactly what she had trained to be, clear and functional and precise, moving through the decision tree with the specific competence that came from having made those decisions in worse conditions with worse stakes. But after, in the corridor, in the quiet, when the structure of the situation released her, that was when the body caught up with everything the mind had been overriding. She put her hands in her jacket pockets. She breathed out slowly. She walked to the stairwell at the end of the corridor, and she pushed the door open, and she sat on the third step from the bottom and put her back against the wall, and looked at the opposite wall, and did the thing she had learned, in a context she was not going to think about in a hospital stairwell, to do when the work was done and the body needed permission to be a body for a minute. 7 years. That was how long she had been doing work that required her to be something other than what she appeared. Not always under this deep a cover, not always this long, but the accumulated weight of it, the identity management, the social performance, the discipline of being invisible in a place where she was not invisible by nature, was a weight she did not talk about and that she was not going to talk about now. She gave herself 4 minutes. Then she stood up and went back to work. The ER was beginning to receive the information. It arrived the way information arrives in hospitals, laterally, through informal channels, carried by people who had been on different floors and seen different things, and were now assembling a picture from fragments. The federal vehicles in the parking lot, the suited people in the lobby, the fact that the pharmacy administration office had been sealed by someone with federal credentials, the fact that Howard Blass had not come back down from the 4th floor. Darla Brentwood was at the nurse's station when the first fragment reached the ER, carried by an orderly named Marcus, who had been on the 4th floor for a linen delivery, and had seen the conference room door open and the investigators in the corridor. He told Darla. Darla told the charge nurse. The charge nurse told Greg Tully, who was still at the station because he had not been able to make himself leave. Greg did not tell them what he knew. He listened and nodded and let them construct the picture from their fragments. Then Megan walked back into the ER. She came through the side entrance with her bag and her jacket and the same expression she had worn for 11 months. Not quite neutral, not quite closed, somewhere in between. She went to the supply cart, which was where she had left it that morning before the administrative summons. Darla said, "Solis." Megan looked at her. "What's happening upstairs?" "I can't discuss an ongoing administrative review." "Howard Blass. Is this about Howard Blass?" Megan looked at her for a moment. "I can't discuss it," she said. She picked up her clipboard. Darla said, "He signed off on the procurement orders for the crash cart restocks, the ones with the expiration date issues." Her voice had changed. Not soft. Darla Brentwood's voice was not soft, but different. "I always thought it was a budget thing. He was always talking about budget." Megan looked at her. She did not confirm or deny, but she did not look away either, and Darla, who was a woman who had spent 16 years reading people in an emergency department, which was its own kind of training, read the look accurately. "Son of a bitch," Darla said, quietly. "Not for performance." Megan went back to the clipboard. Greg Tully came to her cart. He stood beside it, not blocking, just near. He said very quietly, "How long?" 11 months, she said. "The whole time. The whole time." He nodded slowly. He was absorbing it the way he absorbed things, not with drama, just with a steady internal processing that showed on his face as a kind of focused stillness. The expired medications in the crash cart, you flagged those in month 1. The substitution rate was the first anomaly I documented. They were billing for name brand and substituting generic and pocketing the margin. Among other things. How much? $6 million across 4 facilities, approximately. He was quiet for a moment. "And Vale?" "Vale is not part of the fraud operation." She looked at the supply cart. "Vale is exactly what he appears to be. That's its own problem." Greg absorbed that too. He said, "The patient, Corey, the acrolein, was that?" "No," she said. "That was just a Thursday." She paused. "A bad Thursday." "But it burned your cover." "I made a call." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she recognized. Not pity, she could not have tolerated pity, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who understood, at least partially, what it cost to make that kind of call, what you had to put down to make it, and what might not be there when you went to pick it back up. "He's alive," Greg said. "Yes," she said. "The paramedics are going to be okay." "Yes." He nodded. He straightened up. "What happens now?" She said, "Now it gets complicated." She was right about that. The complexity arrived in waves, the way complexity always does in institutions. First the shock, then the legal response, then the political response, and finally the response that nobody anticipated because institutions are made of people, and people do not behave predictably under pressure. The wave that arrived first was Blass's attorney. He appeared at the hospital at 4:30, a man named Gerald Ferris, who wore the particular suit of someone who had been doing criminal defense for 30 years and who had seen enough institutional fraud cases to know exactly which version of events would serve his client best. He went directly to the 4th floor. He was there for 2 hours. When he came out, the story had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to change what was in the documents on the table, but Ferris had found something to work with, which was the question of chain of custody. Who had obtained the pharmacy administration documents? Under what authorization? Whether the federal investigative authorization Megan had produced was in order. Ware had anticipated this. The authorization was in order. But Ferris was not going to concede that without examination, which meant the next 72 hours were going to involve attorneys on both sides reviewing documentation while Blass remained in the building under a consent agreement that kept him from accessing pharmacy records or communicating with the other facilities. The wave that arrived second was from the District Health Authority. The administrator who had been in the conference room went back to his office and made 3 phone calls that generated 2 additional investigators, a formal notification to the State Attorney General's office, and a press inquiry that someone had tipped off. Not where, not Fossey, not anyone in the conference room that afternoon, which meant someone who had seen the vehicles in the parking lot had made a call, and the question of who and why would be its own investigation later. The press inquiry went to the hospital's communications office, which went to Fossey, who issued a holding statement that confirmed only that the hospital was cooperating with an ongoing federal review and that patient care had not been affected. It was technically accurate. It was also the kind of statement that tells any experienced reporter that the actual situation is significantly worse than the holding statement. The third wave was the one nobody predicted. It came from the ER. At 5:45, while Megan was finishing the inventory round she had started that morning and interrupted by the administrative summons, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she recognized. ICU, 4th floor, Dale Corey's nurse. The message said, "He's asking for the nurse who was in the room with him. Says he remembers her voice. Wanted you to know he's off the vent." She stopped moving. Off the vent, less than 40 hours after arrival. She stood in Bay 4 with her clipboard and looked at the message and stayed very still for a moment. Not performing stillness, just still. The particular stillness of someone absorbing something that matters and not wanting to lose it to motion. She typed back, "Tell him I'm glad." She put the phone away. She finished the inventory round, but when she walked past Bay 1 at 6:15, she stopped. The bay was empty now. Cleaned, restocked, the decontamination tape removed, the room returned to its ordinary functional state. Nothing in it showed what had happened there on Thursday morning. Rooms don't hold that. People do. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She thought about 7 years, about the accumulated weight she had given herself 4 minutes for in the stairwell, about the question she had been sitting with for 11 months, which was the question of what comes after, which was not a question she had a clear answer to because the work had always generated the next assignment and the next and the one after that, and she had not had occasion to ask whether that was what she wanted or simply what she was. She thought about Dale Corey's voice on the text, not his voice, his nurse's paraphrase of it, but the shape of it. A man who had been 6 hours in a failing cab with a chemical he couldn't smell, asking for the person who had talked him back from the edge of something. She thought about, "I'm glad." She turned and walked out of the bay and back into the corridor and went back to work, because that was what there was right now, and she was not good at not working. At 7 o'clock, Dr. Vale came out of his office. He had been in there for most of the afternoon. The department had noticed his absence the way it noticed everything, not with commentary, just with the particular atmospheric change of a space whose central organizing presence is not present. People had worked differently. Not better or worse necessarily, just differently. With a certain room for lateral decision-making that was usually absorbed by Vale's directiveness. He came to the charge desk. He reviewed the current patient board. He asked 2 questions about pending labs. Then he looked down the department to where Megan was charting at the secondary nurses' station. He walked over. She looked up when he was 6 feet away. She did not put down her pen. He said, "The administrative review." "Yes," she said. "It's been suspended." "I know. Because there's a federal investigation active in the building." "Yes." He looked at her. He had the expression of a man working through something in real time, which was not an expression she had seen on him before. His face was usually certain, even when the certainty was wrong. This was different. "The investigation. How long has it been active?" "I can't discuss that." "Were you investigating the hospital when you applied here?" She looked at him. "I can't discuss that," she said again. "That's a yes," he said. She did not confirm it. She did not need to. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him making the internal adjustments, the recalibration that she had watched people make before when the structure of their understanding of a situation shifted. Most people resisted it. Most people found a way to reassert the original reading because the original reading was comfortable and the revision was not. Vale said, "The things I said to you over the past 11 months. She held his gaze. "You already knew they weren't true," he said. "Yes," she said. "That must have been." He stopped, started again. "That's not how I want to run this department." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 10 different things she could say. She said none of them. She said, "The decontamination protocol has a gap in it. The one I raised at the staff meeting 4 months ago. It still needs to be fixed. That's not related to anything else. It's just a gap. He looked at her. I'll fix it, he said. He walked back to the charge desk. She watched him go. She did not feel the vindication she had thought she might feel in a moment like this. She felt tired, which was honest, and she felt the specific texture of an institution beginning, slowly, reluctantly, the way institutions move, to examine itself, which was not satisfaction, but it was something. She went back to charting. The fourth wave arrived at 9 o'clock that night, and it was the one that changed everything. It came in the form of a phone call to the hospital's main line, routed through the operator to the nursing supervisor on duty, who passed it to the charge desk, who called Megan's personal cell because the caller had specifically asked for her by name, not by her alias, not by the employment record name, by her actual name. She answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end was young, female, frightened in the specific way of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had finally decided that being frightened of one thing was worse than being frightened of another. The voice said, "My name is Lauren Corey, Dale Corey's daughter. I'm 23. I'm a pharmacy tech at Millhaven District Medical." Millhaven District Medical was one of the 4 facilities in Megan's documentation. Megan sat up. "I'm listening," she said. Lauren stopped, started again. "I've been seeing things at work for about 8 months, in the procurement records. Things that didn't add up. I thought I was wrong. I thought maybe I didn't understand the system well enough. But then my dad ended up at your hospital, and I was looking up information about what happened to him, and I found another stop. There's a name on the documentation from your facility, the approval signatures. I recognized one of them. I see that name every week." Megan was already on her feet and moving to the stairwell. She wanted privacy. She wanted walls between this conversation and the corridor. "Tell me the name," she said. Lauren told her. It was not a name in Megan's file. It was a name she recognized, not from the investigation, not from any document she had assembled in 11 months, but from the 3rd page of the personnel file she had read that morning. The file that Daniel Ware had sent to Greg Tully. The file with the federal header and the redacted operational assignments. It was the name of someone who was supposed to be part of the team that was investigating Howard Blass. She stopped moving. She was in the stairwell, 2nd floor landing, with her back against the wall and the fluorescent light humming above her and the sound of Lauren Corey's frightened breathing on the other end of the phone. "Lauren," she said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Where are you right now?" "My car, the parking lot at my work. I just got off a shift." "Is there anyone with you?" "No." "Does anyone know you're making this call?" A pause. "I don't think so." Megan pressed the phone against her ear and thought fast. The kind of fast that was not frantic, but was everything she had. Every operational instinct, every pattern recognition, every piece of information she had been assembling for 14 months, reorganizing itself around this new variable. If the name Lauren had given her was accurate, if there was a connection between someone inside the investigative structure and the Blass operation, then the case was not what she had built it to be. The case was more complicated, more embedded, more dangerous than a pharmaceutical diversion scheme run by one compliant hospital administrator. And the documents she had handed over in that conference room today, the ones she had given to Ware, needed to be in different hands. "Lauren," she said, "I need you to drive to a public place, somewhere with people and cameras. Do not go home tonight. Do not contact anyone from your workplace. Text me when you get there." "What's happening?" "I don't know yet. But you did the right thing calling. I need you to be safe while I figure it out." Lauren said, "My dad. Is he—" "Your dad is off the ventilator," Megan said. "He's going to be okay." A sound on the other end that Lauren was trying to contain, not quite succeeding. "Okay," Lauren said. "Okay." "Go," Megan said. She hung up. She stood in the stairwell with the phone in her hand and the fluorescent light humming and thought about the name Lauren had given her. She pulled up the contacts on her phone, not her personal contacts, a separate encrypted application that she accessed through a secondary protocol, and she looked at the name in her contact list that corresponded to the name Lauren had said. She had 2 options. She could call Ware, or she could call the number above Ware's in the chain, The number she had been told to use only if the primary contact was compromised. She looked at both numbers. She thought about Dale Corey, stable in the ICU. She thought about Lauren Corey in a parking lot with 8 months of frightened knowledge and a name that was breaking something open. She thought about $6 million across 4 facilities and what that kind of money bought and who it needed to buy and how deep that buying went. She called the number above Ware's. It rang once. A voice answered that she had not heard in 14 months. Not Ware, not anyone from the current operational structure. A voice she recognized from before all of this. From the 7 years before this. From the work that had made her what she was and that had cost her things she had not finished counting yet. The voice said, Solis. She said, we have a problem. The voice said, I know. A pause, short, waited. We've been monitoring the call logs. We saw Lauren Corey's number come through. Another pause. Megan, the name she gave you. Yes, Megan said. We've known about it for 6 hours. The stairwell was very quiet. Then why, she said carefully, did you send me into that conference room today? The pause before the answer was 3 seconds long, which was 2 seconds longer than it should have been. And in those 2 seconds, Megan's entire operational read of the situation shifted in a way that made the floor feel less stable than it had been. Because the conference room was not the operation, the voice said. The conference room was the distraction. She said, what's the actual operation? The voice said, we need you to go to Millhaven District Medical, tonight. The evidence Lauren Corey has access to, the internal records that aren't in the procurement system, the secondary ledger that Blass's counterpart there has been maintaining, we need it before morning, before anyone in that building has time to scrub it. You have investigators. We don't have anyone at Millhaven who knows that building, who knows pharmaceutical storage systems, who can move through a hospital without generating attention. She closed her eyes for a moment. Millhaven is 40 minutes from here, she said. Yes. My cover is effectively burned. At Harlow County, yes. Millhaven doesn't know your face. She opened her eyes. She looked at the stairwell door. Through it, she could hear the ER. The monitors, the voices, the ambient controlled urgency of an emergency department running at night. She had given herself 4 minutes in this stairwell earlier. She did not have 4 minutes now. I need a vehicle, she said. There's one in the lot. And I need someone to stay with Lauren Corey. Already en route to her location. And I need the building layout for Millhaven Pharmaceutical Storage. Being sent to your encrypted app now. She looked at the stairwell door one more time. This operation, she said, the one tonight, is Ware read in? Another pause, shorter this time, but there. Ware is being managed, the voice said. Being managed. Not yes, not Ware's clean. Being managed, which was the specific phrasing that meant the answer was not simple and that she was not going to get the full version of it in this stairwell in this moment. She had been doing this for 7 years. She knew what being managed meant. She knew what it cost. She knew what happened to the people who got managed when the operation turned out to be larger than they knew. She thought about a lot of things very fast. She said, I'll be in the lot in 10 minutes. She pushed the stairwell door open and found Dr. Preston Vale standing in the corridor outside it, 3 feet from the door, with the expression of a man who had been on his way to the stairwell for his own reasons and who had heard, through a door that was thinner than any institutional door should be, the last 90 seconds of a conversation he was not supposed to hear. He looked at her. She looked at him. His face was doing something she had not seen on it before. Not the controlled certainty, not the professional authority, not even the complicated recalibration of earlier. Something simpler and more human. Something that was almost fear, but not quite. More like the feeling that comes just before fear, when the world has revealed itself to be a different shape than you thought it was. He said, Megan, not Solis. Megan. She said, Dr. Vale. He said, what is actually happening in this hospital? She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than she could afford. She made a decision. Come with me, she said. Vale followed her without asking where they were going. That surprised her slightly. She had expected resistance, a demand for explanation, the instinct of a man accustomed to leading to assert that instinct even in a situation he didn't understand. But he fell in behind her without a word, and she moved fast through the corridor toward the side exit, and he kept pace, and neither of them spoke until they were through the door and in the cold night air of the parking lot with the building at their backs. She stopped at the edge of the lot. The vehicle the voice had described was there. Dark sedan, 2 rows back, engine off, different from the one Greg had seen yesterday. Same plates format. She said, "How much did you hear?" "Enough," Vale said. "Millhaven. A secondary ledger. Someone named Ware being managed." He paused. "What does being managed mean?" "It means I don't fully know whose side he's on tonight." Vale was quiet for a moment. The cold air was doing something to his face, stripping the professional layer off it, leaving something that looked older and less certain and more honest. "The investigation," he said. "How far up does it go?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm going to Millhaven." "Tonight." "Tonight." He looked at the sedan, he looked at her. He said, "The incident report I filed. Against you. It doesn't matter right now." "It does matter. I filed it because you made me look like I didn't know what I was doing in my own department." "You didn't know what you were doing in that specific situation," she said. Not cruel, just factual. He took that. He didn't argue it. That told her something about him that 11 months of watching him hadn't told her. That under the performance of authority was a man who could, when sufficiently stripped of context, hear a true thing. "I'm going to Millhaven," she said again. "There's evidence there that needs to come out before morning. After that, the full picture of what's been running through this hospital's supply chain for 3 years is going to be on a federal prosecutor's desk. And the people who made it possible, including the ones who have been inside the investigative structure itself, are going to have to account for it." Vale said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. "Stay in the building. Stay visible. If anyone asks about me, you don't know where I am. If Ware or anyone from the federal team comes looking for me before I contact you, you call this number." She pulled out a card. Plain, a handwritten number, the kind that doesn't exist in any contact list. "Not your phone. The charge desk landline." He took the card. He looked at it. "You carry these around?" "I carry a lot of things you haven't seen," she said. She got in the sedan. She did not look back at him as she pulled out of the lot. She did not have the capacity for that right now. She had 40 minutes to Millhaven, a building layout downloading to her encrypted app, a name that was threatening to rewrite the last 14 months, and a 23-year-old pharmacy tech sitting alone in a public parking lot somewhere holding 8 months of frightened knowledge. She called Lauren Corey as she pulled onto the highway. Lauren answered on the first ring. She was at a 24-hour diner on the east side of Millhaven. There were people around her. She had ordered coffee she hadn't touched. The person Megan's contact had sent was already there. A woman Lauren described as being in a dark jacket who had sat down across from her without introduction and shown her a credential that Lauren didn't recognize but that had made her feel, she said, slightly less like the walls were closing in. "Good," Megan said. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 35 minutes. Don't tell anyone where you are. Not family, not friends." "What about my dad? Can I call him?" "Not tonight. I know that's hard." A pause. "Is he in danger?" "No. He's in the ICU with monitors and nursing staff, and your father is the one thing in this situation that is completely safe." She meant it, and she let it into her voice because Lauren needed to hear it. "He is okay. You are okay. I need you to hold on for 35 minutes. Lauren said, "Okay." Then, "You're the one who was with him, in the room." "Yes." "He said he heard someone talking to him. He said it was the reason he kept trying to breathe." Megan kept her eyes on the highway. The rain had started again, light and steady, the kind that blurs taillights into soft smears of red. "Tell him I'm glad he kept trying," she said. She hung up. She drove. The building layout for Millhaven District Medical came through at 9:47, 12 minutes into the drive. She reviewed it at a red light. Not thorough, not the kind of review she would have given it under better conditions, but enough. Pharmaceutical storage was on the basement level, which was standard for controlled substance security. Administrative pharmacy offices were on the second floor. The secondary ledger Lauren had described, a physical ledger, not digital, which was how Blass's counterpart here had been keeping it off the networked records, was in the office of the Director of Pharmacy Services, a man named Gary Trout, whose name was in the lower tiers of her documentation but had not been a primary target. He was a primary target now. She thought about where. She thought about being managed and what that meant operationally. Ware had been her primary contact for 14 months. He had been the one who received the documents she had put on the conference room table that afternoon. Those documents were now in federal custody, which meant they were in a chain that ran through Ware's office, which meant that if Ware was compromised, partially, even marginally, there was a window between now and whenever the chain locked down in which records could be flagged, conversations could happen, buildings could be visited. She did not think Gary Trout knew she was coming. She needed to be right about that. She pulled into the Millhaven District Medical parking lot at 10:22. The hospital was smaller than Harlow County General, 3 floors above ground, 1 below, the kind of regional facility that serves a population spread thin across rural distance. The night shift had reduced the staff to its functional minimum. The parking lot was a third full. She sat in the car for 90 seconds. She thought about the operational question, which was the question of authorization. She was on administrative reassignment from Harlow County General. She had no clinical authority at Millhaven. The federal investigative authorization she had produced that afternoon was real, but its scope was formally bounded to Harlow County General's records, and the voice on the phone had not sent her here through any channel that would appear in a warrant application. She was going into this building without authorization she could produce. She had done that before, in places where the stakes were different and the risks were higher, and there was nobody to call if it went wrong. She had done it, and she had lived with the consequences. Not easily, not cleanly, but she had lived with them. She got out of the car. She went in through the emergency department entrance because emergency departments at 10:30 on a Thursday night are the one part of a hospital where an unfamiliar face raises the least suspicion, because emergency departments are always receiving unfamiliar faces. She moved through the waiting area and into the corridor beyond it, as if she knew where she was going, which she did, which was the layout download doing its job. The stairwell to the basement was at the end of the main corridor, past radiology. She took it. Gary Trout's administrative office was not in the basement. It was on the second floor, which she already knew, but she was going to the basement first because the secondary ledger, according to Lauren, was not in Trout's office. It had been there until 3 months ago, when Lauren had seen Trout move it, not carrying it out, but moving it, relocating it within the building during what Lauren had understood at the time to be a routine secure storage audit. Lauren had seen where he put it, controlled substance vault, basement level, inside a specific cabinet that was registered to an inactive pharmacy protocol, a storage designation that hadn't been used in 8 months, that appeared in the records as empty, and that was therefore the last place anyone doing a standard audit would open. She found the vault in 4 minutes. The layout was accurate. The door had a keypad lock and a secondary manual tumbler, which she spent 90 seconds on before the secondary gave. Not because she was exceptional with locks, but because the manual tumbler was a model she had encountered before, in a context that made this moment feel almost manageable by comparison. The cabinet registered as inactive. She opened it. The ledger was there. It was a standard composition notebook, the kind with the marbled black and white cover that cost $2, the kind that was invisible in any setting because it looked like nothing. She picked it up. She opened to a page in the middle and looked at what was there. Numbers, dates, names. Not coded, not encrypted. Trout had been confident enough in the physical concealment to skip encryption, which was a specific kind of arrogance that she had seen before and that made investigators' lives occasionally easier. Column headers in standard accounting format, purchase order number, amount invoiced, amount actually paid, margin, routing. The routing column had codes she recognized from her Harlow County documentation. The same codes, the same shell vendor designation, the same approval chain, and at the top of each page, initialed in the same small, precise handwriting, GT, for Gary Trout. And below those initials, on every third page or so, a second initial set. Different handwriting, smaller, more careful. She looked at those initials. She turned 3 more pages. The second initial set appeared 12 times across the ledger, always on pages where the margin column showed the largest figures, always on the pages that were, effectively, the authorization pages, the ones that signed off on the largest diversions. The initials were D.W. Daniel Ware. She stood in the basement vault with the ledger in her hands and the fluorescent light humming and the full weight of what she was looking at settling into her chest. Not peripheral, not a coincidence of initials. 12 times. Specific pages, specific amounts. The signature of someone who was not just aware of the operation, but had been authorizing its largest transactions. She had handed 14 months of evidence to a man who was in this ledger. She photographed every page. Encrypted app, immediate upload to a remote server that she controlled and that was not accessible through any of the channels where touched. 31 pages. She photographed each one twice to ensure legibility. She put the ledger back in the cabinet exactly as she had found it. She locked the manual tumbler. She took a breath. She went back to the stairwell. She was at the first floor landing when she heard the exterior door open at the bottom of the stairwell. 2 voices. Male. Not hospital staff. The footsteps were wrong, too purposeful. The particular cadence of people moving through a building they are not navigating but executing a route in. She went still. She was 4 steps above the landing. The voices were at the exterior door, still opening it. She had maybe 8 seconds before they reached the bottom of the stairwell and looked up. She went up instead of down. 2nd floor. She pushed through the stairwell door and into the corridor and walked, not ran. Walking draws less attention than running in a hospital corridor. Toward the nursing station at the far end, which had 2 nurses behind it and the ambient busyness of a night shift that was occupied with its own concerns. She reached the station and said, to the closer of the 2 nurses, "I'm looking for the pharmacy administrative office. I have a late delivery authorization." She produced the federal credential card, which was technically not current and which this nurse would have no reason to know was not current. "Routine verification, I just need to confirm receipt." The nurse pointed. "Second door past the elevator, but the pharmacist on call is down in dispensing." "That's fine, I just need the reception log." She walked to the second door past the elevator. It was unlocked, which meant Trout had not come back tonight, which meant the 2 sets of footsteps in the basement stairwell were not Trout. She went in. She stood behind the door in the dark office and listened. The corridor outside remained quiet. She waited 3 minutes. Then she heard it. A voice. From somewhere down the corridor. The particular controlled tone of someone on a phone call they did not want to be overheard making. She could not make out words. She could make out tone. And the tone had an urgency that was specific. That was the urgency of someone who had been told something that required immediate response. She moved to the door and opened it 1 inch. The man in the corridor was facing away from her. Dark jacket. The build and posture of someone she had seen in the 4th floor conference room that afternoon. One of the 2 federal investigators who had come in with Ware. Not Ware himself. A member of Ware's team. He was on the phone saying, in the controlled urgent tone she had heard, "She's already been in the basement. We're too late for the vault. We need Trout now. We need him to move the—" He stopped. He turned. He saw the inch of open door. She was already moving. Sick. She did not run through the hospital. She walked with the precise controlled speed that is the fastest you can move in an institutional corridor without triggering the automatic alarm of running, which draws every set of eyes in a building. She went down the corridor away from him, toward the far stairwell, not the one she had come up, the one on the opposite end of the floor that the layout had shown her and that she had filed away as the exit she would use if the primary route was unavailable. Behind her she heard him coming, not running either, the same institutional fast walk, the same calculation. He was speaking into his phone again, short words she couldn't parse. She reached the far stairwell door. She went down. 1st floor. She went through the 1st floor corridor at the same speed, past the radiology darkroom, past a housekeeping cart, past a patient transport aide pushing an empty wheelchair who looked at her with mild curiosity and looked away. The ER entrance was 30 feet ahead. Her phone buzzed. She did not look at it. She pushed through the ER entrance and into the waiting room and through the outer doors and into the parking lot, and she got to the sedan and got in and started it and pulled out of the space before the stairwell door behind her opened. She was on the road in 40 seconds. She looked at the phone. The buzz had been a text from the voice, the number above Ware's. It said, "Ware has gone dark. Do not return to Harlow County. Meet at the secondary location. You know where." She did know where. She also knew that she was now driving on a highway at 11 o'clock at night with photographs of a ledger that implicated a federal investigator in a $6 million healthcare fraud operation, with a compromised primary contact and a chain of custody problem, and a 23-year-old woman in a diner who was the only other living person who had seen that ledger with her own eyes. She called Lauren. Lauren answered. The woman in the dark jacket was still with her. Lauren's voice had steadied in the 40 minutes since the last call. Not calm, but no longer at the edge. Megan said, I need you to go with the woman who's with you, right now. Don't ask where, just go. Lauren said, Did you find it? Yes. A pause. Is my dad going to be okay? Not medically, is all of this going to be okay for him? Megan drove. The rain was heavier now. The road was the specific dark of rural highway at night, the headlights picking out the line between pavement and shoulder. Your father got sick from a chemical he couldn't see coming, she said. He did nothing wrong. Everything that comes out of this investigation protects him, not threatens him. His name is not in anything that will harm him. Okay, Lauren said, then quietly, thank you for being in the room with him. Megan did not have an answer for that was professionally appropriate or tactically useful. She said, Go with the woman, now. She hung up. She drove toward the secondary location, which was 40 minutes in the opposite direction from Harlow County General, a logistics facility that was the kind of place operations used when the primary infrastructure was no longer safe, which was what this was. Her mind was running parallel tracks, which was something she had trained to do and that she was doing now without choosing to. One track on the immediate operational situation, one track on the larger picture that the ledger had just redrawn. DW in the ledger, 12 entries, the largest transactions, the authorization layer. Where had been her contact? Where had received her documents? Where had been in that conference room when she put 14 months of evidence on the table and named Howard Blass, which meant Ware had sat across from Blass in that moment, knowing that Blass's operation was Ware's operation, that the investigator and the investigated had been the same person, and he had sat there with a folder and said nothing. She thought about the 2 months it would have taken to finalize the federal warrant package, the 6 to 8 weeks the voice had described as necessary, the timeline she had burned when she treated Dale Corey in Bay 1. She thought about whether the timeline had been real. She thought about whether the delay, the 6 to 8 weeks, had been operational necessity or operational cover, whether someone had been managing the warrant package the way Ware was now being managed, dragging the timeline while the money continued to move. She thought about the voice on the phone that had told her Ware was being managed and sent her to Millhaven and said the conference room had been a distraction. She thought about who benefits from the distraction. The secondary location came into view. A low building off a county road, lights on in 2 windows, 2 vehicles she didn't recognize parked outside. Not the dark sedan style of federal vehicles. Different. She slowed. She did not pull in. She drove past. She went another half-mile and pulled onto the shoulder and turned the headlights off and sat in the dark with the engine running and the rain on the roof and looked at the road behind her in the mirror. No one followed. She looked at the phone. She had the number above Ware's, which the voice belonged to. She had the credential chain that number was attached to. She had, in the encrypted app, photographs of 31 pages of a ledger with DW initialed 12 times. And she had now a specific and urgent question about the secondary location and the 2 unfamiliar vehicles, and whether the voice that had sent her there was the 3rd layer of this operation, or the 2nd, or something she had not yet mapped. She pulled out the plain card she kept for situations like this. Not the one she had given Vale, the one she kept for herself. 1 number on it, written in her own handwriting, that she had not called in 14 months because she had not needed to, and because calling it carried its own costs, and because the person on the other end of it occupied a part of her history that she kept at a specific distance for specific reasons. She looked at the card. She looked at the secondary location in her mirror, lights on, 2 windows, 2 vehicles. She thought about all the layers she could see and the ones she couldn't. She dialed. It rang twice. A woman answered. The voice was familiar in the way of things you have known so long that familiarity has become structural, part of the framework rather than a feature of it. The woman said, I wondered when you'd call. Megan said, Tell me who set up the secondary location. A pause. Short. Significant. How far out are you? Half a mile. I drove past it. Good. the woman said. Don't go in. Megan stared at the mirror, the lit windows, the rain. Who is it? The secondary location was set up by Ware 18 months ago, the woman said. Before you were deployed to Harlow County, before the OIG referral. It's a collection point, not a safe house. A pause. Megan, the operation you have been running for 14 months is real. The fraud is real. Blass is real, but it was designed to run long enough to identify you. The car was very quiet. Identify me, she said. There are people who have wanted to know what you know and who you answer to for a very long time. The pharmaceutical fraud was the mechanism. You were the target. The woman's voice was steady, in the way of someone delivering information they have been holding for too long and that they are not apologizing for even though they should. I found out 6 hours ago. I have been trying to reach you. Megan looked at the road ahead, empty, dark, the rain coming down. She thought about 14 months. She thought about Dale Corey and the acrolein and the call she had made, and whether the call had been her judgment or whether it had been what someone had been waiting for. The moment when the cover broke and she became visible, and the mechanism that had been designed to identify her finally had a face to put to the file. She thought about the ledger. DW. 12 entries. She thought about whether DW was Ware, or whether DW was someone else, and Ware was the layer she was supposed to find, and the ledger was the document she was supposed to photograph, and the encrypted upload she had sent to the remote server had gone somewhere she had not intended. She said, "The server. The upload." "Yes," the woman said, quietly. "I know." Outside, a vehicle turned onto the county road from the direction of the secondary location. It was moving slowly, not fast, not the speed of pursuit, more the speed of a vehicle that knows approximately where it's going but is not certain of the exact address. Its headlights swept across the back of the sedan as it passed. It did not stop, but it slowed, and in the moment before it continued on, Megan saw the passenger side window lower, and she saw the person in the passenger seat looking directly at the shoulder where the sedan was parked with the lights off, and she recognized the face. Not from the conference room, not from the hospital, not from 14 months of Harlow County General. From before. From 7 years before. From the operational assignment that had cost her the things she had not finished counting. From the room where she had been something other than a supply nurse or an investigator or any of the designations that came after. The face of someone who should not exist in this county, on this road, on this night. The vehicle continued past, and its taillights disappeared into the rain. Megan held the phone against her ear and did not move. The woman on the other end said, "Megan, are you still there?" She said, "The person in the vehicle that just passed me." "Yes." "How long have they been in this?" A pause that was too long. "From the beginning," the woman said. "They were in it from the beginning." Megan looked at the empty, rain-dark road where the taillights had been. She looked at the plain card in her hand, her own handwriting, the number she had not called in 14 months. She said, "Whose side are you on?" And the woman, who had been her commander once, years ago, before the assignments that came after, before all of it, said the one thing that was worse than a lie. She said, "It's more complicated than sides." It's more complicated than sides. Megan looked at the road for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of rain and dark and the sound of her own breathing in a car with the engine running and no headlights. And then she made the calculation she should have made 4 hours ago, which was to stop trusting the infrastructure entirely. She hung up. She put the phone on the passenger seat. She turned the headlights on and pulled back onto the county road, not toward the secondary location, not toward Harlow County, not toward any point on the map that anyone who had been managing her for 14 months would predict. She drove north for 6 minutes until she found a gas station with the particular fluorescent brightness of a place that was open all night and had cameras. And she pulled in and parked under the lights and sat there. She picked up the phone. She opened the encrypted app. The photographs were there, all 31 pages, double captured, uploaded to the remote server. She had uploaded them believing the remote server was clean. The woman's voice had implied it wasn't, but the woman's voice had also, in the same conversation, told her not to go into the secondary location, which had been accurate information, which meant the woman was either genuinely trying to help her or was managing her in the opposite direction from wherever Ware was managing her, and either way, the photographs existed somewhere that wasn't only her phone. She needed them to exist somewhere else. She needed them to exist somewhere that wasn't in any chain she had touched tonight. She thought about who that was. She thought about a man at a nurse's station in Harlow County General who had been in emergency medicine for 20 years and who had received a text from an unknown number that told him to look at a personnel file and who had not, in 11 months, ever given her a reason to doubt him. She called the charge desk at Harlow County General. It rang twice. The night charge nurse answered. Megan said, "Is Greg Tully still in the building?" A pause. "He came back in around 8. He's in the break room. Transfer me." The break room phone rang 4 times before Greg picked up, which meant he had been asleep, which meant he had been at the hospital for 16 hours and had fallen asleep in the break room rather than go home, which was either dedication or avoidance, and she did not have time to figure out which. He said, "Tully." "It's Megan." A beat. She heard him sit up. "Where are you?" "Not near the hospital. I need you to do something, and I need you to not ask me to explain it right now." "Okay. I'm going to send you a set of photographs to your personal phone. 31 images. I need you to forward them to the State Attorney General's tip line, the Healthcare Fraud Division, not federal, state. The submission link is on the AG's public website. You don't need an account. You can submit anonymously. Use the break room Wi-Fi, not the hospital network." A pause. State AG. State, not federal. "Do you understand the difference I'm making?" "I understand the difference," he said. His voice was careful. He was not a man who needed everything explained twice. "You found something that goes into the federal chain. Something that compromises part of the federal chain, yes." "All right." Another pause. "You okay?" It was such a straightforward question that it took her a moment to answer it. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because nobody had asked her that in a direct, uncomplicated way in a very long time, and the simplicity of it landed differently than she expected. "Not entirely," she said, "but I will be." "Then go do what you need to do," he said. "I'll handle this end." She sent the photographs. She watched the confirmation appear on her screen. She looked at the gas station lights and the empty county road and the rain that was finally starting to ease. Then she called the one number she should have called from the beginning, which was the one she had specifically avoided for 14 months because it was outside her operational structure and because she had believed, up until 3 hours ago, that her operational structure was sound. The number rang once. The woman who answered was not the woman from the card. This was a different woman entirely. A deputy director of the HHS Office of Inspector General who had been investigating internal corruption within that same office for 7 months, whose name was Patricia All, and whose number Megan had been given by a colleague 18 months ago with the instruction to use it only if the operation became something other than what it appeared to be. It had become something other than what it appeared to be. Megan spoke for 11 minutes. She did not editorialize. She gave all the operational timeline, the document chain, the DW initials in the ledger, the secondary location, the face in the vehicle on the county road. She told all about the remote server and its compromised status, and the state AG submission that Greg Tully was making from a break room at Harlow County General. Aol listened without interrupting. When Megan finished, All said, "The person you saw in the vehicle." "Yes." "You're certain?" "I'm certain." All was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you see them?" 38 minutes. "And the ledger is still in the vault at Millhaven?" "Physically, yes. I photographed it and replaced it." "We can have a recovery team at Millhaven in 90 minutes, All said, "with a state warrant. The state AG's office is already activated. They've been building a parallel case for 4 months. Your submission from the break room is going to hit a team that is already looking at this." A pause. "Megan, I need to know one more thing." "What?" "Daniel Ware. Where is he right now?" "I don't know." "If he's trying to reach you." "I've stopped answering channels he has access to." "Good." Another pause, shorter. "Go back to Harlow County. Go in the building. Stay visible and documented. What happens next needs you to be on record as present in the institution, not on a county road at midnight." Megan looked at the gas station lights. "I know. You did the right thing calling me. I should have called you 14 months ago." All said, "You didn't know 14 months ago what you know tonight. That's not a failure. That's just how it went." She said it without softness, just as a fact, which was the correct way to say it. Drive safe." She hung up. Megan sat for another 30 seconds. Then she pulled out of the gas station and drove south toward Delwood City and Harlow County General, and she drove in the particular focused quiet of someone who has made every decision available to them and is now simply moving toward the consequences. She walked back into the ER at 12:40 in the morning. The night shift had the quality it always had at that hour. Stripped down, essential, the department running on its minimum necessary staff with the particular tired competence of people who have been awake since the previous afternoon. The patients in the bays were the overnight cases, the chest pain that hadn't resolved, the pediatric fever, the elderly man with altered mental status whose family was asleep in plastic chairs in the waiting room. Greg Tully was at the nurse's station. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting, who is relieved, who is going to have a lot of questions later and understands this is not the time for them. He said, "It's submitted." "Thank you. Want to tell me what you were doing out there?" "Later," she said. "Vale's been asking about you." She looked toward the administrative corridor. "Where is he?" "Walked the floor about 20 minutes ago. He's in his office." She went to Vale's office and knocked. He answered immediately, which meant he had not been sleeping either. He looked at her. He looked at her jacket, damp from the rain. He looked at her face, which she knew carried the particular compressed quality of someone who had been through a great deal in a short time and was not yet finished. He said, "Tell me you're okay. I need you to do something," she said. "Tomorrow morning, when administration opens, I need you to formally rescind the incident report." He said, "Already done. I submitted the withdrawal at 9 tonight." She looked at him. "You were right," he said simply. "About Corey. About the protocol gap. About—" He stopped. "I've been running this department on the assumption that authority and knowledge were the same thing. They're not. I knew that technically. I stopped practicing it." She did not have the space right now to give that the response it deserved. She said, "Thank you." "Is it over?" he asked. "Whatever was happening tonight?" "Almost," she said. She went back to the nurse's station. She picked up a chart that needed review. She sat down and worked, and Greg Tully sat beside her and worked, and the night shift continued around them, and the patients in the bays were monitored and cared for, and the department functioned, and nobody watching from the outside would have known that the woman reviewing charts at the nurse's station was in the center of something that was, even now, moving fast toward resolution without her. That was the part nobody tells you about this kind of work. The part where you set the mechanism, and then you have to stand away from it and let it run. Because the mechanism has your hands in it now, and if you pull back, you break it. And so you sit at a nurse's station at 1 in the morning, reviewing charts, and trusting that the 31 photographs and the 11-minute phone call and the 20 years of work that led to this specific night were enough. She had never been good at trusting that. She reviewed charts anyway. At 6:15 in the morning, Patricia Ohl called. Megan stepped into the corridor outside the nurse's station. The hospital was starting its morning transition, the shift change energy building, the daytime staff arriving, the overnight staff gathering what was left of themselves for handoff. All said, "Millhaven is secure. The ledger was recovered at 2:30. Gary Trout was taken into custody at his residence at 4 o'clock this morning on a state warrant. He cooperated fully beginning at approximately 4:45. Megan said, "Where?" Daniel Ware was arrested at 5:10 at a private address in Clearfield County. The arrest was made by the state, not federal, which means his office's jurisdiction doesn't apply. He's in state custody. She pressed the phone against her ear. The person from the vehicle. Detained and in federal custody under a separate warrant that was already in progress, All said. Your identification last night corroborated information that 2 other sources had already provided. It was the final piece. A pause. The person from before. The operational assignment. Yes. They've been running as a double asset for approximately 4 years. They were not originally part of this fraud case. The intersection happened when Ware brought them in as a secondary layer, specifically to manage the investigation's timeline. Another pause. I'm sorry. That's a difficult thing to hear. It was a difficult thing to hear. She had known it was coming since the county road in the rain, and knowing something is coming does not make it not difficult. She stood in the hospital corridor and held that for a moment. Not longer than a moment, but genuinely, because the alternative was putting it somewhere she'd have to go get it later at a worse time. Blass, she said. Howard Blass entered a cooperation agreement with the state AG's office at 11 last night. He's providing a full account of the operation, all 4 facilities, the financial routing, and the internal federal contact, which corroborates the ledger. All's voice had the measured quality of someone reading from notes while also monitoring the person on the other end of the call. Megan, the operation is resolved. The people who ran it are in custody or cooperation. The evidence is documented, secured, and in a chain that Ware never touched. A pause. See, it worked. She looked at the hospital corridor, the morning light coming through the window at the end, the orderly pushing a linen cart, 2 nurses coming off the overnight in their coats. The case, she said, my documentation, the 14 months, will be fully entered into the state record under your actual name, not your alias, your name. All said it with the precision of someone who understands that the difference between those 2 things is not administrative. You will be credited, publicly, in the case filing, by name. Megan said nothing for a moment. The woman I called last night, she said, the number from the card. She's being reviewed, All said. I can't tell you more than that right now. I don't think she's compromised in the way Ware is compromised. I think she's someone who knew more than she should have and told you less than she should have and made choices that were in a gray area that the review will have to sort out. A pause. She did tell you not to go into the secondary location. Yes, Megan said. That counts for something. I know, Megan said. I know it does. She hung up. She went to the break room and made coffee and sat at the table where she had eaten alone for 11 months, and she drank it slowly and let the morning come in through the window, and she did not think about anything for a little while, which was its own kind of competence. The news reached Harlow County General in the particular way that news reaches institutions that are implicated in it, not cleanly, not in a single announcement, but in the accumulation of fragments that arrived through different channels across the course of the morning. The state AG's press release came out at 9 o'clock. It named Howard Blass, Gary Trout, and Daniel Ware. It described a 34-month pharmaceutical diversion fraud operation across 4 healthcare facilities in the district, totaling approximately $6.2 million in fraudulent billing and controlled substance diversion. It described the investigation as a joint state-federal effort in cooperation with a confidential federal operative embedded at Harlow County General. It did not name Megan Solis. That came separately, at 10:30, in a supplemental release from the HHS Office of Inspector General that was more specific about the investigative methodology, and that included, in its 3rd paragraph, a sentence that Darla Brentwood read on her phone at the nurse's station, and then read again and then carried to Greg Tully without saying anything, just handing him the phone. The sentence said, the 14-month embedded investigation was conducted by federal operative Megan Solis, a decorated former military trauma specialist whose prior service record includes classified operational assignments across multiple theaters and whose identification of a pharmaceutical toxicity case during a mass-casualty event at Harlow County General precipitated the accelerated resolution of the broader fraud case. Greg read it. He read it again. He said, decorated former military trauma specialist. Darla said, classified operational assignments across multiple theaters. They both looked at the ER, where Megan was at the supply cart on the east wall, finishing the morning inventory round. The department absorbed the news in its own way, in the way that places absorb information that requires them to fundamentally re-examine what they thought they knew. It was not a sudden shift. It was the slow, uncomfortable movement of people who had made assumptions, comfortable, convenient, sometimes cruel assumptions, confronting the cost of those assumptions not abstractly but specifically. Darla Brentwood, who had been the distributor of the departmental consensus on Megan Solis, did not handle this quietly. She handled it the way she handled most things, at the nurse's station, out loud, without performing a grace she did not entirely feel yet. She walked to the supply cart. She said, Solis. Megan looked up. Darla stopped. She was not a woman who apologized easily. She was also not a woman who pretended she had nothing to apologize for. I ran my mouth about you for 11 months. I know, Megan said. I made sure people thought you were arrogant, that you thought you were better than everyone. I know, Were you? Darla said. I mean, were you actually thinking that? Or were you just doing the job? Megan thought about it honestly. I was doing the job, she said, but I wasn't easy to know. That part wasn't performance. Darla looked at her for a moment. No, it wasn't. She said it without apology for the observation, which was the most honest thing she could have offered. The expired medications in month 1. You flagged those. Yes. That was the investigation. Partly. It was also just expired medications in a crash cart. Darla was quiet. Then she said, I'm sorry. For the 11 months. Megan looked at her. I know, she said. She went back to the inventory. Darla stood there a moment longer. Then she went back to the nurse's station. She did not cry, because Darla Brentwood had not cried at work in 16 years and she was not starting now. But there was something in her face as she sat back down that Greg Tully noted, something that was not comfortable and that was not supposed to be comfortable, and that was, in its discomfort, the beginning of something more accurate than what she had been carrying. Howard Blass made his first public statement through his attorney at 11 o'clock that morning outside the state courthouse in Delwood City. The attorney read the statement. Blass stood beside him in a suit that had been correct yesterday and looked diminished today. The statement admitted no specific guilt, but confirmed full cooperation with prosecutors. It was the statement of a man who had calculated that cooperation was his least bad remaining option and had chosen it the way you choose the least painful of painful things. Not with relief, not with resolution, just with the particular tired certainty of someone who has run out of alternatives. He did not look at the cameras. Gary Trout's attorney issued a brief statement confirming cooperation. Trout himself was not present. Daniel Ware appeared in state court at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for an initial hearing. The charges were healthcare fraud conspiracy, obstruction of a federal investigation, and abuse of official position. He entered no plea. His attorney requested a continuance. The judge granted 14 days. Ware was released on a bond that his attorney had negotiated down to a number that was still very large and that represented, along with the charges themselves and the Federal Internal Affairs Review that had been opened simultaneously, the beginning of an accounting that would take years to complete, but it had begun. That was the thing about institutions and the people who exploit them. The beginning of the accounting is the loss of the thing they most depended on, which is the assumption that they are too embedded to be touched. Once that assumption is gone, the rest follows. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it follows. At Harlow County General, Richard Fossey called a staff meeting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was present, and Sandra Okafor was present, and a representative from the District Health Authority was present, and what they delivered was a combination of institutional acknowledgement and operational response that was not satisfying in the way that justice in stories is satisfying, but that was, in the real way of things, more than most institutions produce under these circumstances. Fosa said the hospital had been the site of a fraud operation that had been running for 3 years without detection. He said the hospital's internal controls had failed to catch it. He said the operational review that would result from the investigation would include a complete restructuring of pharmaceutical procurement oversight, independent auditing of controlled substance handling, and a review of the mechanisms by which staff concerns had historically been, and he chose his word carefully here, deprioritized. He did not say the word suppressed. He said deprioritized, which was the institutional word for it, and everyone in the room understood what it covered. Then he said that the investigation had been conducted by a member of the hospital's support staff who had worked under conditions of significant personal and professional difficulty, including active institutional resistance to her clinical observations, and that the hospital intended to formally acknowledge that, in writing, in the public record. He said her name. The room was quiet. Then Priya, who was in the second row, started clapping. It was not coordinated. It was not performed. It started with Priya, and it spread, the way things spread when they express something that people have been holding without knowing what to do with it. And it was not unanimous. There were people in that room who clapped because others were clapping, and there were 1 or 2 who did not clap at all, which was honest, but it was real, and it lasted longer than courtesy required. And it was the specific sound of an institution trying, imperfectly and belatedly, to correct its own record. Megan was not in the staff meeting. She was in the ICU. She had gone up at 2:30, before the meeting because the ICU nursing staff had called down to say that Dale Corey was asking for her again, and this time he was awake enough to be specific about it. She found him in bed 4, off the ventilator, with supplemental oxygen at 2 liters through nasal cannula and an IV running maintenance fluids, and the particular exhausted alertness of someone who has come back from the edge of something and is still taking stock of what they have come back to. His daughter Lauren was in the chair beside his bed. Lauren stood when Megan came in, and Megan saw the exhaustion in her. The overnight, the diner, the woman in the dark jacket, the long hours of not knowing, and also saw the relief, which was so comprehensive that it had simplified Lauren's face to something younger than she was. Corey looked at Megan. He was pale and had lost weight in 2 days that his body had not had to lose, and his voice when he spoke was rough from the ventilator, and he was the most alive she had ever seen a person look. He said, "You're the one who was in the room." "Yes," she said. "I heard you talking," he said. "I couldn't understand most of it, but I heard you." She sat in the second chair, the one by the window. She did not know exactly why she sat instead of standing. Some instinct that this was not a professional interaction and should not look like one. "You told me to keep trying to breathe," he said. "You did," she said. "That was you." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his daughter, who looked back at him with the expression of someone who has been frightened for 48 hours and is still in the process of allowing herself to stop. He said, "Lauren told me about the other thing, the hospital, what you were doing there." "Yes." "She said you were undercover, that the reason you were in that ER at all was to investigate something." "Yes." "And then I came in." "Yes." He thought about that. She watched him think about it, the specific quality of a man working through the shape of his own luck. "So me getting sick, that was just bad Tuesday in March," she said. He almost laughed. It was rough and short, and it cost him something, but it was real. "You broke your cover for me," he said. She looked at him. "I made a call." "You broke your cover for me," he said again, not asking, saying, "A stranger." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to answer that honestly. She thought about what the correct professional response was, which was something like the patient outcome took priority or standard triage protocols or any of the formulations that made the decision into a procedure rather than a choice. She said, "You were dying." He looked at her. "That's all it was," she said. "You were dying, and I knew how to stop it, and the only cost was something I was going to lose anyway." She paused. "The case was already built. It just needed the right chain of custody." He said, "That's a hell of a way to look at it. It's an honest way." He was quiet again. Then he said, "My daughter found the ledger. She made the call." "She did?" "She's been carrying that for 8 months, scared to death." Megan looked at Lauren. "She did the right thing. That took a different kind of courage than what I did." Lauren said quietly, "I almost didn't call." "I know," Megan said. "That's what makes it count." They sat in the ICU room for a while, the 3 of them, with the monitor beeping its steady reassurance and the afternoon light coming through the window, and Megan stayed longer than she had planned to because this was the part that she did not usually get in the work she did. She did not usually get to sit in the room afterward with the person who survived and the person who had been brave in the afternoon light, and it turned out that it was a specific and real thing to have, and she had not known she needed it until she was sitting in it. When she left, Corey said, "Thank you." She said, "Get better." She went back to the ER. The afternoon shift was running its normal, controlled chaos. The staff meeting had ended. People were back at their stations. The rhythm of the department had absorbed the morning the way emergency departments absorb everything, imperfectly, incompletely, but forward. Greg Tully was signing in for an evening shift he hadn't been scheduled for. He had gone home at noon and come back at 4, which was the behavior of a man who was not entirely sure what to do with himself when the thing he had been quietly paying attention to for 11 months had resolved, and who had decided that the place that made the most sense was the place where he had been paying attention. He saw her come off the elevator. He said, "How is he?" "Off the vent, talking, watching his daughter like he's counting her." Greg nodded. "Priya told me about the meeting." "I heard." "Fossey said your name." "I heard." He looked at her. "What happens to you now?" She had been thinking about that in the gaps between the afternoon's events. Not anxiously. She had moved past the range where uncertainty felt like a threat, somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning on a county road in the rain. But she had been thinking about it in the specific way of someone taking stock of what is true. What was true was that Harlow County General was not her assignment anymore. The case was in the state AG's hands, and Patricia All's hands, and the hands of the court, and those were the correct hands for it, and her role in it was complete. What was true was that her operational cover was gone, thoroughly and publicly, and the life she had been living in the East Side apartment with the corkboard and the technical manuals was a version of a life that had served a specific purpose, and that the specific purpose had now been served. What was true was that she was 34 years old and had been doing this specific kind of invisible, careful, costly work for 7 years, and that 7 years was not forever, but it was long enough to ask the question. She said, "I don't know yet." Greg Tully said, "You could stay." She looked at him. "Not as a supply nurse," he said. "Obviously not as a supply nurse, but the department." He said it carefully, not with sentimentality. "The protocol gap you identified, the expired medication audits, Corey." He paused. "There's a difference between a department that has someone who knows what you know and one that doesn't. I've been in both. I know which one I want to work in." She looked around the ER. Bay 1, with its decontamination tape long removed. The charge desk where Darla Brentwood was on the phone with her coordinator voice, efficient and specific. Priya at the monitor station, looking up and catching her eye and doing something with her face that was not quite a smile but was close. The orderly named Marcus, pushing the linen cart past Bay 3 with the headphones he was not supposed to wear during shift, and that nobody had ever bothered to enforce. She had spent 11 months learning this place the way you learn a place you are in, but not of. Learning its routines and its rhythms and its failures and its small heroisms, which every emergency department has. The things that happen in the bays at 3 in the morning when nobody is watching that would make you understand what people are capable of when they are asked to be. She had not let herself be of this place because she could not afford to be. That was the job. You learn the place and you do not become it. But the job was done. She said, "I'll think about it." Greg said, "That's more than I expected." She almost smiled. Not quite. "Don't push it." He went to the charge desk. She went to the supply cart because the morning inventory round had been interrupted and the cart was still where she had left it, and she was still, technically, on shift until 6, and there was work that needed doing that nobody else was going to do. She picked up her clipboard. She moved through the bays. Bay 1, Bay 2, Bay 3. The familiar sequence, the par levels, the expiration checks, the quiet work that holds a department together from the inside and that almost nobody with authority ever notices. She had done this for 11 months as a mechanism. Tonight it was just what her hands were doing while the rest of her caught up. At 5:30, a representative from the HHS Inspector General's office arrived at the hospital. Not all. Someone from her team, a young woman named Torres who had the particular energy of a person delivering news she was genuinely glad to deliver. She found Megan at the supply cart in Bay 4. She handed her an envelope. Inside was a one-page document, formal, headed, the kind of document that exists in a record permanently. It was a formal commendation from the OIG's office, citing the embedded investigation, the evidence recovered, the patient life saved on the morning of the mass-casualty event, and the identification of corruption within the investigative infrastructure itself, which the document described as exceptional operational judgment under circumstances of compromised institutional support. At the bottom of the page, below the official language and the signatures, someone had added a handwritten note in the margin. Megan recognized the handwriting. It was Patricia All's. The note said, "You trusted the right people at the right time. That's harder than it sounds." Megan folded the document and put it in her jacket pocket. She thanked Torres. Torres left. Megan stood in Bay 4 for a moment with her hand over her jacket pocket, over the document inside it. 7 years of classified assignments, redacted records, names she could not say in rooms where it mattered. 7 years of being the thing that needed to be invisible to be useful, of building competence in conditions that would not appear on any credential, of knowing things and carrying them alone because that was the requirement, because the work demanded it, because she had believed the work demanded it, and had not asked often enough whether the work was right about everything it demanded. She thought about Dale Corey's voice, rough from the ventilator. "You told me to keep trying to breathe." She thought about Lauren Corey in a diner at midnight with 8 months of frightened knowledge and the courage to pick up the phone. She thought about Greg Tully, who had been watching for 11 months with the patient attention of a man who trusted his own read of people even when the read didn't make sense yet. She thought about what it cost to be invisible. Not the professional cost, the operational cost. She had always understood that. The other cost. The one that accumulates in the gaps between assignments and East Side apartments with corkboards and technical manuals and lunches alone in break rooms where people had decided they already knew who you were. She had let them decide because it was easier, because contested ground requires presence, and presence was what she could not afford. But the thing about deciding you can't afford a thing is that you end up paying for it anyway, differently, in a currency that doesn't appear in any accounting. She thought about the decontamination protocol gap that Vail had said he would fix. Small thing, technical thing. A gap in a procedure that, unfixed, meant the next Dale Corey had a worse chance than this one. She had flagged it 4 months ago in a staff meeting and been shut down in front of 12 people, and then she had written it in her notebook and kept going. It was going to get fixed now. Not because she had performed some dramatic action, because she had stayed, because she had known something and carried it and brought it to the surface at the right moment. And sometimes that was what it took, and it was not glamorous, and it was not cinematic, and it was exactly what it was. She went back to the cart. She finished the inventory. At 6 o'clock, she signed out at the nurse's station. She hung the clipboard on its hook. She picked up her jacket from the locker room. The same locker, the same combination, the same water bottle she had put in there that morning. And she walked out through the ER entrance into the evening, which was cold and clear. The rain finally finished, the sky the specific dark blue of an early spring night. She sat in her car in the parking lot. She sat there for a while. She thought about a conversation she had not had yet, and that she was going to have, with the woman from the card and the woman's answer, and what it's more complicated than sides actually meant when you unpacked it, which was something she was going to have to sit with for longer than tonight. She was not going to resolve it in a parking lot. Some things did not resolve. They clarified, slowly, over time, into a shape you could live with. She thought about what Greg had said. You could stay. She thought about what it would mean to stay. Not undercover, not invisible, just here. In this department, in this city, with the people she had spent 11 months not letting herself know. Doing the work she had done, but as the person she actually was. Which was a different thing, a harder thing in some ways, because invisibility is its own kind of shelter, and there is no shelter in being seen. But Dale Corey was alive, and Lauren had made the call. And $6.2 million in fraudulent billing was in the hands of a state prosecutor. And a decontamination protocol gap was going to be fixed. And sometimes the work that matters most is the work that looks, from the outside, like nothing. The inventory rounds, the expiration checks, the quiet woman with the clipboard who sees what nobody else sees and carries it until the moment it needs to be put somewhere. The woman who does not need to be in the center of the room to change what happens in the room. She started the car. She did not go home to the East Side apartment. She drove to a different part of the city, a part she had identified 6 months ago and filed away. A neighborhood with a coffee shop that stayed open late, and an apartment building 2 blocks from it with a vacancy sign that had been up for 3 months. She had driven past it 4 times. She had not stopped. Tonight she stopped. She sat outside for a moment. Then she got out of the car. She walked to the building. She pressed the call button for the manager. She was going to ask about the vacancy. She was going to stay in Delwood City. Not because it was the plan. Not because a mission required it. Because Dale Corey was alive 2 miles away. And Greg Tully was at a nurse's station she had learned the rhythms of. And there was a department that had a gap in its decontamination protocol and a pharmaceutical oversight structure that needed rebuilding from someone who knew what she knew. And sometimes the reason you stay somewhere is not a strategic calculation. Sometimes it is just the accumulation of the things that happened there. The manager answered the intercom. Megan said, "I saw the vacancy sign. I'd like to see the apartment." The door buzzed open. She went in. She did not think about what came after. She thought about the door in front of her and the stairs beyond it and the apartment she had not seen yet, which might be wrong in a dozen ways, which would probably not be exactly what she needed. which would require her to make it work in the imperfect, incremental way that things get made to work when you decide to actually be somewhere. She had spent 7 years being somewhere in order to leave. She was going to try being somewhere in order to stay. The door at the top of the stairs was number 7. She stood in front of it. She thought about all the rooms she had been in, the ones that required her to be something other than what she was, the ones where she had stood with steady hands in difficult circumstances and done the work and walked out and let the room close behind her like it had never happened. She thought about Bay 1, the monitor with its numbers moving in the wrong direction and then slowly, reluctantly, the right direction. The voice she had used to talk a man back to his daughter. The medication drawn and ready in her hand, the weight of it. The specific concrete weight of knowing what to do and having what you need to do it in a room where someone is dying and you are the reason they don't. That was not a classified asset or a call sign or a commendation in an envelope. That was just what she was. She raised her hand and knocked.